Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honored if you subscribed. Picture this. Deep within medieval castles, SS officers gather by candlelight performing ritualistic ceremonies. Expeditions race across continents searching for mythical relics. High-ranking Nazis consult astrologers before making crucial military decisions. And at the center of it all, a dictator convinced that supernatural forces could secure his empire for 1,000 years. But here's what's fascinating. While Hollywood has turned these stories into blockbuster adventures, the reality is far more complex and, in many ways, more bizarre than any movie could capture. Some of these tales are absolutely true, documented in Nazi archives and witness testimonies. Others are complete fabrications that have grown into legend over the decades, and the most intriguing ones fall somewhere in between, where historical evidence meets speculation in ways that continue to puzzle researchers today. I'm going to take you on a journey through the shadowy intersection of Nazi ideology and occult obsession, where we'll separate documented fact from persistent myth. We'll explore the real expeditions, the actual ceremonies, and the genuine beliefs that influence some of history's most consequential decisions. But more importantly, we'll discover why understanding this strange chapter matters far beyond mere curiosity about the past. Let me give you a preview of what we're about to uncover together. We'll visit Wewelsburg Castle, where Heinrich Himmler transformed a Renaissance fortress into what he called the center of the world, complete with a mysterious crypt that still sends chills down visitors' spines today. We'll follow Nazi expeditions to Tibet, where SS scientists searched for evidence of an ancient Aryan master race, bringing back footage and artifacts that raise more questions than they answer. And we'll examine Hitler's personal collection of occult objects, including items he believed held supernatural power over life and death. But here's where this gets really interesting. I've spent months researching primary sources, declassified documents, and testimonies from people who were actually there. What I discovered is that the truth about Nazi occultism is simultaneously less sensational and more unsettling than the myths suggest. The reality reveals something profound about how dangerous ideologies can twist human curiosity about the unknown into tools of power and manipulation. So settle in, because we're about to explore one of the most mysterious aspects of World War II, where archaeological digs become treasure hunts, where ancient symbols get weaponized for modern evil, and where the line between rational planning and mystical thinking becomes terrifyingly blurred. The story begins long before Hitler rose to power, in the aftermath of Germany's defeat in World War I. The country lay devastated, not just physically, but spiritually. Traditional institutions had crumbled, the economy was in ruins, and millions of Germans felt lost in a world that no longer made sense. Into this void stepped various groups offering alternative explanations for their nation's suffering, and many of these groups looked to the occult for answers. One organization that would later capture the imagination of conspiracy theorists was the Thule Society, founded in Munich in 1918. Named after a mythical northern land from ancient Greek literature, the Thule Society blended German nationalism with occult practices and racial theories. Members gathered in darkened rooms, discussing everything from astrology to ancient Germanic runes, convinced that Germany's destiny was written in the stars and ancient prophecies. Now here's where we need to be careful about separating fact from fiction. Popular accounts often claim that the Thule Society directly created the Nazi Party, with Hitler himself participating in seances and magical rituals. The reality is more nuanced and, frankly, more historically significant. While the Thule Society did provide early financial backing and meeting spaces for what would become the Nazi Party, There's no credible evidence that Hitler was ever a member or participated in their occult activities. However, several early Nazi leaders did have connections to the Thule Society, including Rudolf Hess, who would later become Hitler's deputy. These connections established a pipeline through which occult ideas and symbols could flow into Nazi ideology, even if they were transformed and secularized along the way. The most obvious example of this influence is the swastika itself. Long before the Nazis adopted it, this ancient symbol had been used by various occult groups as a representation of cosmic forces and racial purity. The Thule Society prominently displayed swastikas in their literature and ceremonies, and when the Nazi Party needed a distinctive emblem, they borrowed this symbol along with its supposed mystical significance. But here's what makes this story more complex than simple cause and effect. Hitler himself appears to have been largely skeptical of organized occultism, at least in its traditional forms. Multiple witnesses describe him mocking fortune tellers and expressing contempt for what he saw as superstitious nonsense. Yet paradoxically, he remained deeply attracted to the power that occult symbolism and mystical thinking could wield over others. This contradiction reveals something crucial about how occult ideas functioned within the Nazi movement. For many leaders, these weren't sincere religious beliefs, but rather tools for manipulation and control. The mystical trappings provided an emotional appeal that pure political ideology couldn't match, tapping into deep human desires for meaning, destiny, and connection to something greater than oneself. Consider how this played out in Nazi propaganda. Party rallies weren't just political gatherings, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies designed to create an almost religious experience. The dramatic lighting, the massive symbols, the rhythmic chanting, the processions through darkened streets illuminated by torches, all of these elements borrowed heavily from occult ritual practices, even when stripped of their original spiritual content. The famous Nuremberg rallies in particular were masterpieces of what we might call secular mysticism. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, and later armaments minister, deliberately designed the rally grounds to evoke ancient temples and sacred spaces. The Cathedral of Light, created by searchlights pointing skyward, wasn't just impressive spectacle, but a calculated attempt to make participants feel they were witnessing something supernatural and historically inevitable. This brings us to one of the most important figures in our story, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and arguably the Nazi leader most genuinely committed to occult beliefs. Unlike Hitler's pragmatic use of mystical symbolism, Himmler appears to have been a true believer in supernatural forces, ancient prophecies, and racial mysticism. Himmler's office was filled with occult books, and he regularly consulted astrologers and fortune tellers. He believed that the SS were modern knights in an ancient tradition, destined to create a new racial order based on mystical principles. This wasn't just personal eccentricity, but became official SS doctrine, influencing everything from recruitment practices to military strategy. Under Himmler's direction, the SS established the Ahnenerbe, or Ancestral Heritage Foundation, in 1935. Officially described as a research organization dedicated to studying ancient Germanic history, the Ahnenerbe became the primary vehicle for Nazi occult expeditions and pseudo-scientific research. With substantial government funding and academic credentials, the Ahnenerbe sent teams of researchers across the globe, searching for evidence to support Nazi racial theories and mystical beliefs. These expeditions weren't small affairs, but major undertakings involving dozens of scientists, photographers, and support staff. The most famous was Ernst Schaffer's expedition to Tibet in 1938 and 1939, which we'll explore in detail shortly. But the Ahnenerbe also sponsored research in Iceland, searching for traces of ancient Aryan settlements, expeditions to the Canary Islands, looking for connections to legendary Atlantis, and archaeological digs across Europe seeking Germanic artifacts. What makes these expeditions particularly fascinating is how they blended legitimate scientific methods with completely unscientific goals. The researchers involved were often credentialed academics who genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge, even as they pursued theories that modern science recognizes as complete nonsense. This combination of scholarly rigor and mystical thinking created a unique form of pseudoscience that was particularly dangerous because it looked authoritative. When SS researchers published papers claiming to have found evidence of ancient Aryan civilizations or mystical properties in Germanic artifacts, these publications carried the weight of academic institutions and government backing. The psychological appeal of these ideas extended far beyond Nazi leadership circles. In a rapidly modernizing world where traditional certainties were crumbling, the promise of ancient wisdom and mystical knowledge offered comfort and meaning to millions of people. The Nazis understood this appeal and exploited it ruthlessly, wrapping their political program in the attractive packaging of spiritual destiny and cosmic significance. But we're just scratching the surface of this strange and troubling story. The real adventures, the genuine mysteries, and the most revealing insights into how occult obsession shaped Nazi policy need to visit the castle where Himmler attempts are still ahead of us. Wed to create a new religious order, follow those expeditions to the roof of the world, and examine the artifacts that Nazi leaders believed could change the course of history itself. The heart of Himmler's occult empire wasn't located in Berlin or Munich, but in an unexpected place. A triangular Renaissance castle nestled in the rolling hills of Westphalia. Wewelsburg Castle, built in the early 1600s, had served various purposes over the centuries, from aristocratic residence to prison. But in 1934, Himmler leased this modest fortress and began transforming it into something the world had never seen before. What Himmler envisioned wasn't just a meeting place or training facility, but the spiritual center of his new SS order. He called it the center of the world, and spent enormous sums of money, equivalent to millions of dollars today, renovating the castle according to his mystical specifications. The project consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere in the German war effort, yet Himmler considered it essential to his cosmic mission. Walking through Wewelsburg today, visitors immediately sensed something unusual about the architecture. The renovations didn't follow any conventional design principles, but rather created spaces that seemed designed for ceremony and ritual. The most striking feature is the North Tower, which Himmler had completely rebuilt to house what he called the Hall of the Supreme Leaders. This circular room, with its massive oak table surrounded by 12 chairs, was clearly modelled after Arthurian legend. Each chair was designated for a specific SS leader, creating a kind of dark mirror of the Knights of the Round Table. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Himmler genuinely believed he was establishing a new knightly order that would rule over a racially pure empire for centuries to come. But the most mysterious space in Wewelsburg lies directly beneath this hall. Himmler had his architects create a circular crypt with a stone floor featuring an intricate design known as the Black Sun. This symbol, consisting of 12 radiating sig runes arranged in a circle, had no precedent in ancient Germanic culture, despite SS claims to the contrary. Instead, it appears to have been created specifically for Wewelsburg, representing Himmler's attempt to invent new traditions that would give his movement the appearance of ancient legitimacy. The purpose of this crypt remains one of the genuine mysteries surrounding Nazi occultism. Some witnesses claimed it was intended for meditation and ritual ceremonies. Others suggested it would serve as Himmler's final resting place, a kind of pharaoh's tomb for the leader of the SS. What we know for certain is that Himmler spent hours alone in this space, often late at night, engaging in activities that even his closest associates found puzzling. The castle also housed an extensive library focused on occult subjects, ancient history, and racial theories. Himmler employed a staff of researchers who combed through medieval manuscripts, folklore collections, and archaeological reports, searching for evidence that would support SS ideology. These scholars produced hundreds of reports and studies, creating a vast pseudo-academic literature that gave occult beliefs the veneer of scientific respectability. What makes Wewelsburg particularly fascinating is how it reveals the intersection between genuine belief and calculated manipulation within Nazi leadership. Himmler's personal correspondence shows that he took the castle's mystical purpose very seriously, often referring to it in language that sounds more like religious devotion than political planning. Yet he also understood its propaganda value, using the castle as a backdrop for ceremonies designed to inspire awe and loyalty among SS officers. The castle's influence extended far beyond its walls, through the elaborate initiation rituals Himmler developed for SS leadership. New officers underwent ceremonies that borrowed elements from medieval knighthood, Masonic traditions, and invented Germanic customs. These rituals weren't just theatrical displays, but psychological tools designed to create intense group loyalty and a sense of participating in something historically significant. One ceremony involved new officers spending a night alone in the castle's crypt, contemplating their role in what Himmler called the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Another required them to trace their ancestry back multiple generations, creating genealogical charts that supposedly proved their racial purity. These practices created powerful emotional bonds between participants while reinforcing the ideological foundations of SS doctrine. The psychological impact of these experiences shouldn't be underestimated. Many participants later described feeling transformed by their time at Wewelsburg, as if they had been initiated into ancient secrets. This sense of special knowledge and destiny became a driving force in SS culture, contributing to the organization's notorious fanaticism and commitment to Nazi goals. But Wewelsburg was just the beginning of Himmler's occult empire. The Ahnenerbe Foundation used the castle as its spiritual headquarters while conducting research projects across the globe. These expeditions combined legitimate archaeological and anthropological methods with completely unscientific objectives, creating a unique form of mystical scholarship that influenced Nazi policy at the highest levels. The most ambitious of these expeditions began in 1938, when Ernst Schäfer, a young German zoologist and explorer, received approval and funding for a major scientific expedition to Tibet. On the surface, this appeared to be a straightforward natural history project, aimed at studying Tibetan wildlife, geography, and culture. But the true objectives were far more complex and tied directly to Nazi racial theories and occult beliefs. Schäfer's team included some of Germany's most accomplished scientists and explorers. Bruno Beger, an anthropologist, was tasked with measuring and photographing Tibetan people to gather evidence about racial characteristics. Edmund Gehr, a geophysicist, would study the region's geological features. Karl Wienert, an entomologist, would collect insect specimens. And Hans Hinterstocker would serve as the expedition's photographer and filmmaker, documenting everything they encountered. But the expedition also included members whose scientific credentials were questionable at best. Several participants were chosen specifically for their commitment to Nazi ideology rather than their academic qualifications. This created tension within the group between those genuinely interested in scientific discovery and those pursuing political and mystical objectives. The journey to Tibet took months, requiring complex negotiations with British colonial authorities and Tibetan officials. The team travelled through India, navigating bureaucratic obstacles and logistical challenges that would have defeated a less determined group. When they finally reached Tibet in early 1939, they found themselves in a land that seemed to exist outside of time, where ancient traditions persisted largely unchanged for centuries. What they discovered there would fuel decades of speculation and conspiracy theories. The Tibetan spiritual traditions, with their emphasis on hidden knowledge, reincarnation, and psychic powers, seemed to confirm many Nazi beliefs about the existence of supernatural forces. The expedition members were particularly intrigued by accounts of advanced spiritual practices that allegedly allowed practitioners to develop extraordinary mental abilities. Beger's anthropological work focused on measuring skull dimensions and facial features, attempting to find evidence for Nazi theories about racial hierarchies. He photographed hundreds of Tibetans and collected detailed measurements, creating a database that he believed would prove connections between Tibetans and ancient Aryan peoples. These studies, while methodologically rigorous by the standards of the time, were based on completely false assumptions about the relationship between physical characteristics and cultural achievement. The expedition's most controversial aspect involved their interactions with Tibetan religious leaders. Several team members claimed to have witnessed demonstrations of supernatural powers, including levitation, telepathy, and the ability to generate intense heat through meditation. While these accounts were almost certainly exaggerated or misunderstood, they became part of Nazi lore about the expedition's discoveries. The team also collected thousands of artifacts, including religious texts, ritual objects, and artwork. Many of these items were shipped back to Germany, where they became part of the Ahnenerbe's research collection. Some artifacts allegedly contained ancient wisdom that could be decoded to reveal advanced scientific knowledge, though no credible evidence has ever been found to support these claims. Perhaps most significantly, the expedition produced extensive film footage and photographs that documented their journey and discoveries. This visual record became a powerful propaganda tool, showing German audiences that their scientists were making groundbreaking discoveries in the most remote corners of the world. The footage suggested that Nazi researchers had access to ancient secrets that other nations couldn't reach, reinforcing beliefs about German superiority and destiny. The expedition's return to Germany in August 1939 coincided with the outbreak of World War II, cutting short plans for follow-up missions and detailed analysis of their findings. However, the Tibet expedition became legendary within Nazi circles, spawning numerous rumors about secret knowledge and mystical discoveries that supposedly gave Germany strategic advantages in the coming conflict. These rumors were encouraged by the expedition members themselves, who found that mysterious hints about their discoveries enhanced their status within the Nazi hierarchy. Rather than simply reporting their actual findings, they cultivated an air of mystery that allowed others to project their own fantasies and expectations onto the expedition's results. The psychological appeal of these stories extended far beyond Nazi leadership. In a world increasingly dominated by industrial warfare and technological advancement, the idea that ancient wisdom might still hold the keys to power offered comfort and meaning to people struggling to understand their place in history. The Tibet expedition became a symbol of Germany's supposed connection to timeless truths that transcended modern limitations. But the expedition's real significance lay not in any mystical discoveries, but in how it demonstrated the Nazi regime's willingness to invest enormous resources in projects based on ideological rather than practical considerations. The money, personnel, and diplomatic effort devoted to the Tibet expedition could have been used for genuine scientific research or military preparation. Yet Nazi leaders considered the search for racial validation and occult knowledge to be equally important priorities. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the war years as Nazi resources were diverted to increasingly desperate searches for supernatural solutions to military and political challenges. The regime that had begun by promising rational, scientific solutions to Germany's problems gradually descended into a world of magical thinking and desperate mysticism as reality refused to conform to ideological expectations. The search for supernatural power wasn't limited to distant expeditions and castle ceremonies. Some of the most persistent legends surrounding Nazi occultism center on Hitler's alleged obsession with ancient relics, particularly objects that medieval tradition claimed possessed divine or magical properties. Among these, no artifact captures the imagination quite like the Spear of Destiny, also known as the Holy Lance. According to Christian legend, this was the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, and over the centuries it had accumulated a reputation for granting victory to whoever possessed it. Charlemagne supposedly carried it into battle, as did various Holy Roman emperors. By the 20th century, the spear resided in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, where it had become a popular tourist attraction and symbol of Austrian heritage. The story goes that a young Adolf Hitler first encountered the spear during his struggling artist days in Vienna, sometime around 1909. Standing before the display case in the palace treasury, he allegedly experienced a profound mystical revelation, sensing that this ancient weapon held the key to his future destiny. According to this tale, Hitler became convinced that possessing the spear would make him invincible, and from that moment forward, his entire political career was secretly driven by a desire to claim this legendary artifact. Now, here's where we need to separate Hollywood drama from historical reality. While Hitler did spend time in Vienna during his youth, and while he certainly visited museums and cultural sites, there's no contemporary evidence that he had any special interest in the Holy Lance during this period. The dramatic story of his mystical encounter appears to have been invented decades later by writers seeking to add supernatural elements to Hitler's biography. However, the spear story contains a kernel of historical truth. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Hitler did indeed order that the Habsburg imperial regalia, including the Holy Lance, be transferred to Nuremberg. This wasn't necessarily because of personal mystical beliefs, but rather as part of a broader propaganda strategy to position Nazi Germany as the successor to the Holy Roman Empire. The symbolism was powerful. The artifacts that had once legitimized medieval German emperors now resided in the city, where Nazi rallies proclaimed a new 1,000-year Reich. But Hitler's relationship with ancient artifacts was more complex than simple treasure hunting. His personal art collection, which grew enormously during the war years, included numerous items with alleged supernatural significance. Some of these were acquired through legitimate purchases, others through questionable deals with desperate collectors, and still others were simply looted from occupied territories. One particularly intriguing acquisition was a collection of medieval manuscripts that supposedly contained alchemical formulas and magical instructions. These texts, many of them beautifully illuminated works from monastery libraries, were studied by Nazi researchers looking for hidden scientific knowledge. The assumption was that medieval alchemists had discovered principles that modern science had forgotten, and that decoding their symbolic language might reveal advanced technologies or supernatural techniques. The reality, of course, was far less exciting. Medieval alchemical texts were indeed sophisticated works, but they represented early attempts to understand chemistry and natural philosophy, rather than magical instruction manuals. Nazi researchers, approaching these documents with predetermined conclusions, often found confirmation of their theories through creative interpretation, rather than genuine discovery. This pattern of finding what they wanted to find characterized much of Nazi occult research. When archaeologists working for the Ahnenerbe excavated Germanic sites, they consistently reported discoveries that seemed to confirm theories about Aryan superiority and ancient advanced civilizations. When anthropologists measured skull dimensions, their data somehow always supported existing racial hierarchies. When linguists studied ancient texts, they found evidence of mystical knowledge that justified Nazi ideology. The psychological mechanisms behind this self-deception reveal something important about how extremist movements use pseudoscience to validate their beliefs. By creating institutions that looked scholarly and employing researchers with legitimate credentials, the Nazis gave their mystical ideas the appearance of scientific authority. This wasn't necessarily conscious fraud, though certainly some participants knew they were manipulating evidence. More often, it represented the human tendency to see patterns and connections that support our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory information. This brings us to one of the most genuinely mysterious aspects of Nazi occultism: The role of astrology in military decision-making. Unlike some of the more sensational claims about Nazi mysticism, there's solid documentary evidence that several high-ranking Nazi leaders, including Hitler himself, consulted astrologers when making important decisions. The most prominent of these advisors was Karl Ernst Kraft, a Swiss astrologer who gained access to Nazi leadership circles through a combination of accurate predictions and skillful self-promotion. Kraft had correctly forecast an attempt on Hitler's life in November 1939, predicting not just the attack, but its approximate timing and location. This success earned him a reputation as a genuine prophet and opened doors to the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. Kraft's influence peaked during the early war years, when German victories seemed to confirm his optimistic predictions about Nazi destiny. He prepared detailed astrological charts for military operations, analyzed the birth charts of enemy leaders to predict their actions, and advised on timing for major political announcements. His reports were taken seriously enough to influence actual policy decisions, including the timing of military offensives and diplomatic initiatives. But Kraft's story also illustrates the dangerous instability of relying on supernatural guidance for practical decisions. As the war turned against Germany, his predictions became increasingly inaccurate, leading to growing skepticism among his patrons. His attempts to maintain credibility through increasingly elaborate explanations for failed prophecies only highlighted the fundamental unreliability of astrological methods. The astrologer's downfall came when he began predicting German defeat, apparently based on his honest reading of celestial signs rather than political expediency. This truth-telling earned him a one-way ticket to a concentration camp, where he died in 1945. His fate demonstrated that even within a regime obsessed with mystical thinking, practical political considerations ultimately trumped supernatural beliefs. Other astrologers and fortune-tellers played smaller but still significant roles in Nazi decision-making. Himmler regularly consulted a Finnish masseur named Felix Kirsten, who combined physical therapy with mystical advice. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, was known to seek guidance from various occult practitioners before making important decisions. Even Hermann Göring, despite his reputation for pragmatic ruthlessness, reportedly consulted astrologers about military strategy. These practices weren't necessarily signs of personal gullibility, but often represented attempts to gain psychological advantages over rivals and enemies. In a political system where personal access to Hitler determined power and influence, claiming special insight into cosmic forces could be a valuable currency. Leaders who could present their recommendations as divinely inspired or cosmically ordained had advantages over those who relied solely on rational analysis. The influence of mystical thinking extended beyond individual consultations to shape broader Nazi policies and strategies. The timing of major operations was sometimes adjusted based on astrological considerations. Propaganda campaigns incorporated astrological themes to appeal to popular beliefs. Even practical matters like industrial production schedules occasionally reflected mystical rather than purely economic thinking. This raises important questions about the relationship between rational planning and irrational beliefs within the Nazi regime. How could a movement that claimed to represent scientific racism and technological advancement simultaneously embrace medieval superstitions and magical thinking? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of extremist ideologies and their relationship to truth. Nazi ideology wasn't really about empirical facts or logical consistency, but rather about creating a compelling narrative that justified predetermined conclusions. Within this framework, any source of information that supported the desired story was welcome, whether it came from rigorous scientific research, creative interpretation of historical evidence, or pure mystical revelation. The movement's relationship to truth was fundamentally instrumental. Ideas were valuable not because they were accurate, but because they were useful for advancing Nazi goals. This instrumental approach to knowledge created a unique intellectual environment where rigorous methodology coexisted with complete fantasy. Nazi researchers could employ sophisticated techniques and advanced equipment while pursuing objectives that were fundamentally unscientific. They could produce detailed reports and impressive documentation while reaching conclusions that had no basis in reality. The consequences of this approach extended far beyond academic curiosity. When political leaders make decisions based on mystical rather than practical considerations, the results can be catastrophic for entire populations. The resources devoted to occult research and mystical projects represented not just wasted opportunities, but active harm to German society and the world. As the war progressed and German prospects dimmed, the regime's reliance on supernatural solutions became increasingly desperate and divorced from reality. Military strategies were developed based on prophecies rather than intelligence reports. Industrial resources were diverted to projects that promised magical rather than practical benefits. Political decisions reflected wishful thinking rather than strategic analysis. The final years of the Nazi regime witnessed an acceleration of mystical thinking as traditional sources of power and legitimacy crumbled. When rational analysis suggested inevitable defeat, occult alternatives became more attractive to leaders unwilling to face reality. This pattern would reach its climax in the bizarre final months of the Third Reich, when Hitler's bunker became a center of desperate mystical speculation about supernatural interventions that might still save the regime. But we're not quite ready for that apocalyptic finale. First, we need to explore the most ambitious Nazi occult project of all: the systematic attempt to rewrite human history itself through archaeological expeditions that spanned continents and consumed enormous resources. These weren't casual treasure hunts, but carefully planned operations designed to find physical evidence for Nazi racial theories and mystical beliefs about human origins. The scope of these expeditions was truly staggering, reaching from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of North Africa, from the mountains of South America to the islands of the Mediterranean. Each expedition was justified by elaborate theories about ancient Aryan civilizations that had supposedly once ruled the world before being destroyed by racial mixing and cultural degeneration. The goal wasn't just to find interesting artifacts, but to reconstruct an entirely new version of human history that would validate Nazi ideology and inspire future generations of believers. These archaeological expeditions reveal perhaps the most systematic attempt in history to use science as a weapon against truth itself. The Ahnenerbe didn't just want to find artifacts, they wanted to rewrite the entire story of human civilization to place Germanic peoples at the center of all historical achievement. The expeditions began modestly enough in the mid-1930s, with excavations in Germany itself. SS archaeologists dug at sites across the Reich, searching for evidence of ancient Germanic greatness, but what they found consistently contradicted their theories. Instead of advanced Aryan civilizations, they uncovered evidence of diverse cultural influences and gradual technological development. Rather than abandon their assumptions, however, the researchers simply reinterpreted their findings or suppressed inconvenient discoveries altogether. This pattern of willful misinterpretation became standard practice as the expeditions grew more ambitious. In 1936, the Ahnenerbe sponsored an expedition to the Canary Islands, convinced that these Atlantic islands were remnants of the lost continent of Atlantis. The theory suggested that Atlantis had been the original homeland of the Aryan race, and that its destruction had scattered the master race across the globe. The expedition team included respected archaeologists and anthropologists who genuinely believed they might make world-changing discoveries. They measured ancient stone structures, collected pottery fragments, and documented local folklore with meticulous care. Their methods were scientifically sound, but their interpretations stretched credibility beyond all recognition. Every carved stone became evidence of advanced Aryan engineering. Every unusual skull measurement suggested Nordic racial characteristics. Every local legend was analysed for hidden memories of Atlantean glory. The researchers produced detailed reports filled with charts, photographs, and scholarly citations, creating an impressive facade of academic rigour around completely unfounded conclusions. The psychological appeal of these discoveries extended far beyond the research teams themselves. Nazi propaganda eagerly promoted stories about German scientists uncovering humanity's hidden past, positioning the Reich as the rightful heir to ancient greatness. These narratives provided emotional satisfaction to audiences hungry for evidence of their special destiny and historical importance. But the Canary Islands expedition was just a warm-up for much grander adventures. In 1938, as tensions mounted across Europe, the Ahnenerbe launched its most ambitious project yet, an expedition to Antarctica. This frozen continent, largely unexplored at the time, became the setting for one of the most bizarre chapters in Nazi occult history. The Antarctic expedition was officially called New Swabia, named after the German region of Swabia. The mission combined legitimate geographical research with wild speculation about hidden civilizations and supernatural phenomena. Team members were instructed to map the coastline, study weather patterns, and search for mineral resources, but they were also told to investigate reports of unusual geological formations that might indicate ancient settlements. The expedition ships carried not just scientific equipment but also ceremonial objects and mystical texts. Some team members later claimed they discovered entrance to vast underground caverns, though no physical evidence of these alleged findings has ever been produced. Others reported strange atmospheric phenomena and unexplained readings on their instruments, though these accounts grew more elaborate with each retelling. What makes the Antarctic expedition particularly fascinating is how it demonstrates the intersection between genuine exploration and complete fantasy within Nazi thinking. The expedition did produce valuable geographical data and contributed to scientific understanding of polar regions. Simultaneously, it generated wild stories about secret Nazi bases and hidden entrances to hollow Earth civilizations that persist in conspiracy theories today. The most persistent legends claim that the expedition discovered a vast underground world populated by advanced beings who shared Nazi racial theories. According to these tales, the expedition established secret bases that continued operating throughout the war and beyond, serving as refuges for Nazi leaders and launching points for post-war activities. While these stories have no factual basis whatsoever, they reveal the powerful psychological appeal of hidden knowledge and secret power that characterized Nazi mystical thinking. The Antarctic expedition ended abruptly with the outbreak of war, but its legacy lived on in Nazi imagination. Throughout the conflict, rumors circulated about secret weapons being developed in polar laboratories and mystical knowledge being extracted from ancient ice formations. These stories provided comfort and hope to true believers even as military reality grew increasingly grim. Meanwhile, other Ahnenerbe expeditions continued their work across occupied Europe. Teams of archaeologists followed advancing German armies, racing to excavate sites before they might be damaged by combat. These expeditions had official priority for transportation and supplies, demonstrating how seriously Nazi leadership took their historical research mission. In occupied France, SS researchers excavated Celtic sites, searching for evidence of ancient Germanic influence. They found sophisticated Iron Age settlements and remarkable artistic achievements, but consistently interpreted these discoveries as proof of Nordic racial superiority rather than evidence of diverse cultural development. Local French archaeologists were either excluded from the work entirely or forced to collaborate with interpretations that violated their professional integrity. Similar patterns emerged across occupied territories. In Poland, Nazi archaeologists focused on sites that might demonstrate Germanic settlement in supposedly Slavic regions. In the Netherlands, they searched for evidence of ancient tribal connections to German peoples. In Norway, they investigated runic inscriptions and medieval artifacts, seeking confirmation of mystical Nordic traditions. Each expedition produced carefully documented reports that looked scientifically authoritative to casual observers. The researchers employed sophisticated techniques, used precise measurement tools, and followed established archaeological protocols. Their photographs were professionally composed, their charts were meticulously drawn, and their conclusions were supported by extensive footnotes and references. But beneath this impressive scholarly apparatus lay a fundamental corruption of the scientific method. The researchers weren't testing hypotheses against evidence, but rather searching for evidence to support predetermined conclusions. When discoveries contradicted Nazi theories, they were either reinterpreted or quietly suppressed. When findings seemed to support ideological positions, they were publicized extensively and used to justify further expeditions. This systematic distortion of archaeological evidence had consequences far beyond academic circles. The expedition's findings were incorporated into educational materials, used to justify territorial claims, and cited as evidence for racial policies. German schoolchildren learned history based on these fabricated discoveries, while conquered populations were told that archaeological evidence proved their natural inferiority to Germanic peoples. The expeditions also served important propaganda functions within Germany itself. News of dramatic discoveries in distant lands reinforced popular beliefs about German scientific superiority and cosmic destiny. Citizens could take pride in their nation's researchers uncovering humanity's hidden past, while other countries remained ignorant of these profound truths. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of these expeditions was how they corrupted legitimate scholarly institutions and individual researchers. Many participants were respected academics who genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge. The combination of generous funding, official support, and peer pressure gradually led them to compromise their professional standards in ways they might never have imagined possible. Some researchers eventually recognized what was happening and attempted to maintain scientific integrity within the system. They submitted honest reports about their findings, refusing to embellish discoveries or ignore contradictory evidence. These individuals often found themselves marginalized or transferred to less prestigious assignments, while colleagues who produced more ideologically satisfying results received promotions and recognition. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this corruption reveal something important about how extremist movements co-opt intellectual institutions. By providing resources, status, and community to researchers, while gradually increasing pressure to produce desired results, the system created incentives that made compromise seem reasonable and resistance seem costly. The expeditions continued throughout the war years, even as resources became scarce and military priorities grew more urgent. Teams of archaeologists worked in dangerous conditions near battle zones, racing to complete their research before advancing enemy forces might interrupt their work. The contrast between these scholarly pursuits and the surrounding destruction highlighted the surreal priorities of a regime that valued mystical validation more than practical military considerations. As German fortunes declined, the expeditions took on increasingly desperate characteristics. Researchers were instructed to search for evidence of ancient weapons or technologies that might provide modern military advantages. Archaeological sites were investigated for clues about supernatural forces that might still be accessible to those who understood their secrets. The final phase of Nazi archaeological research reflected the broader collapse of rational thinking within the regime. Projects that had begun with at least superficial scientific credibility devolved into pure treasure hunting and mystical speculation. Researchers abandoned scholarly protocols entirely, focusing instead on finding artifacts that might possess magical properties or contain encoded messages from ancient masters. Throughout this strange journey from legitimate research to complete fantasy, one pattern remained consistent: the human capacity for self-deception when powerful incentives reward particular conclusions. The Nazi archaeological expeditions demonstrate how quickly scholarly disciplines can be corrupted when political pressure combines with ideological fervor and institutional support. But these expeditions represented only one facet of the broader Nazi attempt to harness supernatural forces for political purposes. As the war entered its final phases and conventional sources of power failed, the regime's reliance on mystical thinking would reach levels that bordered on complete detachment from reality. The story of these final desperate attempts to find salvation through occult means reveals both the ultimate futility of magical thinking and its persistent appeal to people facing insurmountable challenges. The collapse of rational decision-making within Nazi leadership didn't happen overnight, but accelerated dramatically as military defeats mounted and territorial losses multiplied. By 1943, as the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, occult advisors found themselves with unprecedented influence over strategic decisions. What had once been marginal consultation became central planning as traditional military and political analysis offered only grim assessments of German prospects. This shift toward mystical solutions created a feedback loop that made rational planning increasingly difficult. When astrological charts suggested favorable timing for military operations, commanders felt pressured to attack regardless of practical considerations. When fortune tellers predicted eventual victory despite current setbacks, leaders delayed necessary retreats or diplomatic negotiations. When archaeological discoveries supposedly revealed ancient weapons or strategies, resources were diverted from proven technologies to pursue mythical alternatives. The human cost of these decisions was enormous, though it would take years for historians to fully document how mystical thinking contributed to military disasters and prolonged suffering. Battles were fought at astrologically auspicious moments rather than tactically advantageous ones. Defensive positions were abandoned because prophecies suggested better fortune elsewhere. Entire army groups received orders based on supernatural guidance rather than strategic analysis. But the most revealing aspect of this descent into magical thinking wasn't its military consequences, but what it revealed about the psychological foundations of the Nazi movement itself. When faced with evidence that their core beliefs about racial superiority and historical destiny were false, true believers didn't abandon their ideology, but instead searched for supernatural explanations that might preserve their worldview intact. This pattern would reach its ultimate expression in the final months of the war, when Hitler's underground bunker became a center of increasingly desperate occult speculation. But before we descend into that apocalyptic finale, we need to understand how the regime's mystical obsessions had already begun reshaping German society in ways that would outlast the war itself and continue influencing popular culture for decades to come. The transformation of German society under Nazi mystical influence extended far beyond government circles and elite archaeological expeditions. By the early 1940s, occult themes had permeated popular culture, educational systems, and everyday life in ways that most ordinary Germans barely recognized. This cultural shift represented perhaps the most successful aspect of Nazi occult strategy, creating a population predisposed to accept supernatural explanations for political events and historical developments. German schools began incorporating mystical elements into their curricula through subjects that appeared perfectly legitimate on the surface. History classes emphasized ancient Germanic achievements while downplaying other civilizations' contributions. Geography lessons included speculation about lost continents and ancient migration patterns that supposedly explained modern racial distributions. Even mathematics instruction occasionally featured problems involving runic calculations and astronomical alignments that had allegedly guided ancient Germanic tribes. These educational changes didn't happen through dramatic announcements or obvious propaganda, but through subtle modifications to existing textbooks and teaching materials. Publishers gradually replaced standard historical accounts with versions that emphasized mystical themes and supernatural causation. Teachers received training that presented these changes as advances in scholarly understanding, rather than ideological manipulation. The result was a generation of students who grew up thinking that supernatural forces naturally influenced historical events. For them, the idea that ancient artifacts might possess special powers, or that astrological considerations should guide political decisions, seemed perfectly reasonable. This cultural foundation would prove remarkably durable, persisting long after the Nazi regime itself had disappeared. Popular entertainment reflected and reinforced these mystical themes through films, novels, and radio programs that presented occult ideas as established facts rather than speculative fiction. German cinema of the 1930s and early 1940s featured numerous adventure stories about archaeological discoveries and ancient mysteries, many of them directly inspired by Ahnenerbe expeditions and research projects. These entertainment productions were remarkably sophisticated in their presentation of mystical themes. Rather than crude propaganda pieces, they were often compelling adventure stories that happened to reinforce Nazi ideological positions. Audiences could enjoy exciting narratives about treasure hunters and ancient secrets while unconsciously absorbing messages about racial superiority and supernatural destiny. The film industry's treatment of occult themes reveals how effectively Nazi cultural strategy operated through entertainment rather than obvious political messaging. Viewers weren't lectured about the importance of mystical thinking, but were instead presented with exciting stories that made such thinking seem natural and appealing. This approach proved far more persuasive than direct propaganda could ever have been. Radio programming followed similar patterns, featuring serialized adventure stories about German explorers discovering ancient civilizations and unlocking cosmic secrets. These programs often incorporated sound effects and musical themes that evoked mystery and supernatural atmosphere, creating immersive experiences that made mystical ideas seem vivid and immediate. The publishing industry embraced occult themes with equal enthusiasm, producing hundreds of books about ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and supernatural phenomena. Many of these publications maintained scholarly pretenses, featuring footnotes, bibliographies, and academic-sounding language that gave mystical speculation the appearance of serious research. Book clubs and reading groups formed around these mystical publications, creating social networks where occult ideas could be discussed and reinforced through peer interaction. These informal gatherings often featured guest speakers who claimed special knowledge about ancient secrets or supernatural phenomena, further legitimizing mystical thinking through personal testimony and social validation. The cumulative effect of these cultural influences was to create an intellectual environment where mystical explanations for political and historical events seemed perfectly reasonable to millions of ordinary Germans. When Nazi leaders made decisions based on astrological advice or archaeological speculation, the public was already prepared to accept such approaches as legitimate forms of knowledge. This cultural preparation proved crucial during the war years, when increasingly desperate military situations required explanations that preserved faith in ultimate German victory. Traditional military analysis offered little hope, but mystical interpretations could always find reasons for optimism in ancient prophecies, supernatural interventions, or cosmic cycles that supposedly favored Germanic peoples. The regime's cultural strategy also created powerful emotional bonds between citizens and mystical themes that transcended rational political considerations. People who had grown up with stories about ancient Germanic greatness and supernatural destiny weren't just intellectually committed to these ideas, but emotionally invested in their truth. Challenging these beliefs meant attacking fundamental aspects of personal identity and cultural belonging. This emotional investment helps explain why mystical thinking persisted among Nazi supporters, even when practical evidence clearly contradicted their expectations. Belief in supernatural forces and ancient wisdom provided psychological comfort and meaning that rational analysis couldn't match, especially during periods of crisis and uncertainty. The international implications of Nazi mystical culture extended far beyond Germany's borders through cultural exchange programs, academic conferences, and publishing relationships that spread occult ideas throughout Europe and beyond. German scholars presented papers at international meetings, where they discussed their archaeological discoveries and historical theories, often to audiences who had no awareness of the ideological agenda behind their research. These international contacts created networks of scholars and intellectuals who became inadvertent promoters of Nazi mystical themes in their own countries. University professors who had attended German conferences returned home with new ideas about ancient civilizations and racial development that gradually influenced their own teaching and research. Publishing houses in neutral countries began translating German books about mystical archaeology and ancient mysteries, spreading Nazi occult theories to audiences who might have rejected obvious political propaganda. These translations often omitted the most explicit ideological content while preserving the underlying assumptions about racial hierarchy and supernatural causation. The result was a gradual internationalization of Nazi mystical thinking that operated independently of official diplomatic channels or military conquest. Ideas that had been developed to support German political objectives found new audiences who embraced them for their apparent scholarly merit or entertainment value. This international diffusion of Nazi occult themes would have lasting consequences that extended well beyond the war years. Popular culture throughout the Western world absorbed elements of Nazi mystical thinking, often without recognizing their ideological origins. Adventure films, fantasy novels, and even academic discussions of ancient history incorporated themes and assumptions that had originally been developed to support Nazi racial theories. The persistence of these cultural influences reveals something important about how extremist ideologies can outlive the political movements that created them. Ideas that seem obviously false or morally repugnant in their original context can survive and spread when separated from their political origins and presented as entertainment or scholarly speculation. But the most significant long-term impact of Nazi mystical culture was its effect on popular attitudes toward the relationship between knowledge and authority. By successfully presenting mystical speculation as legitimate scholarship, the regime created lasting skepticism about the ability of rational analysis to provide definitive answers to important questions. This skepticism opened space for alternative forms of knowledge that claimed access to hidden truths unavailable through conventional research methods. Ancient wisdom, supernatural revelation, and intuitive understanding could all claim equal validity with scientific investigation, creating an intellectual environment where any sufficiently confident assertion might be accepted as truth. The educational and cultural changes implemented by the Nazi regime didn't disappear when Germany surrendered in 1945. Many teachers continued using modified textbooks that emphasized mystical themes. Publishers kept producing books about ancient mysteries and supernatural phenomena. Film studios continued making adventure stories that presented occult ideas as plausible explanations for historical events. This cultural continuity meant that post-war generations grew up with many of the same mystical assumptions that had characterized Nazi ideology, even though the explicit political content had been removed. The result was a persistent fascination with occult themes and alternative history that would influence popular culture for decades to come. The psychological appeal of mystical thinking proved remarkably adaptable to new political and social contexts. Ideas that had originally been developed to support Nazi racial theories found new applications in Cold War conspiracy theories, New Age spirituality, and contemporary alternative history movements. This adaptability reveals something profound about the human attraction to mystical explanations for complex phenomena. When faced with uncertainty, ambiguity, or threatening circumstances, people often prefer supernatural theories that offer clear villains, hidden meanings, and ultimate redemption to rational analyses that acknowledge complexity and uncertainty. The Nazi exploitation of these psychological tendencies created templates for mystical thinking that could be applied to virtually any situation where people felt powerless or confused. The specific content might change, but the underlying structure remained constant. Secret knowledge exists that explains everything. Special individuals have access to this knowledge, and those who accept these revelations will ultimately triumph over their enemies. Understanding these patterns becomes crucial for recognizing how mystical thinking continues to influence contemporary political and cultural movements. The specific symbols and stories may differ, but the psychological mechanisms remain remarkably similar to those that allowed Nazi occult ideas to gain such widespread acceptance during the 1930s and 1940s. As we prepare to explore the final, desperate phase of Nazi mystical thinking, when rational decision-making collapsed entirely under the weight of supernatural speculation, it's important to recognize that these weren't merely historical curiosities, but examples of persistent human tendencies that continue to shape our world today. The lessons learned from studying Nazi occultism extend far beyond understanding a particular historical period. They reveal fundamental truths about how extremist movements exploit human psychology, how institutions can be corrupted through gradual compromise, and how mystical thinking can serve as both symptom and cause of political and social breakdown. The story we're about to conclude demonstrates what happens when these tendencies reach their logical extreme, creating a feedback loop of delusion and desperation that ultimately destroys the very people it claims to serve. But first, we need to witness the final act of this strange drama, where the underground bunkers of a collapsing regime became the setting for humanity's most desperate attempt to find salvation through supernatural means. The final months of World War II witnessed an unprecedented collapse of rational decision-making within Nazi leadership circles, as military defeats and territorial losses created a psychological crisis that traditional political thinking couldn't address. With conventional sources of hope exhausted, the regime's remaining leaders turned increasingly to mystical advisors and supernatural explanations for their desperate circumstances. Hitler's underground bunker complex beneath Berlin became the epicenter of this descent into magical thinking, where astrological charts competed with military maps for strategic attention, and ancient prophecies carried more weight than intelligence reports. The physical environment itself contributed to this psychological transformation, as the artificial lighting, concrete walls, and complete isolation from natural rhythms created a dreamlike atmosphere where normal reality seemed suspended. Within this surreal environment, time itself became distorted as leaders lost track of day and night cycles, living instead according to schedules determined by astrological calculations and mystical ceremonies. Important meetings were postponed or accelerated based on planetary alignments rather than tactical considerations, while crucial decisions waited for favorable omens that might never arrive. The bunker's library expanded dramatically during this period, filling with occult texts, ancient prophecies, and mystical interpretations of current events that offered hope where rational analysis provided only despair. These books weren't merely consulted for guidance, but studied with the intensity that military planners might once have devoted to strategic assessments and enemy capabilities. Staff members later described an atmosphere of increasing unreality where fantastic schemes and supernatural interventions seemed more plausible than conventional military or diplomatic solutions. Conversations that might once have focused on troop movements and supply lines instead revolved around cosmic cycles, ancient curses, and prophetic visions that supposedly revealed hidden patterns in current events. The influence of mystical thinking extended beyond individual decision-making to reshape the entire structure of Nazi command and control systems. Traditional military hierarchies were supplemented or sometimes replaced by networks based on occult knowledge and supernatural authority, where access to ancient secrets could override conventional rank and experience. This organizational transformation created chaos within German military and civilian administration, as competing sources of authority issued contradictory orders based on different mystical interpretations of the same situation. Units in the field received instructions that reflected astrological timing rather than tactical necessity, while supply priorities were determined by symbolic significance rather than practical military requirements. The psychological mechanisms behind this collapse reveal something profound about how extremist ideologies respond to existential challenges. Rather than adapting their beliefs to accommodate contradictory evidence, true believers often intensify their commitment to mystical thinking as a way of preserving core assumptions about their movement's ultimate righteousness and inevitable triumph. This intensification creates a dangerous feedback loop where each failure to achieve predicted outcomes leads not to skepticism about mystical methods, but to more desperate searches for supernatural solutions. The logic becomes circular. If mystical guidance hasn't produced victory yet, it must be because the wrong techniques are being used or insufficient commitment is being demonstrated. The bunker period witnessed increasingly elaborate attempts to contact supernatural forces that might intervene on Germany's behalf, including seances designed to communicate with deceased Nazi heroes, rituals intended to invoke ancient Germanic deities, and ceremonies aimed at activating mystical properties supposedly contained in various artifacts and symbols. These activities weren't conducted secretly, but became central to the bunker's daily routine, with high-ranking officials participating in occult practices that would have seemed absurd to them just months earlier. The transformation wasn't sudden, but gradual, as each small compromise with mystical thinking made the next step seem reasonable and necessary. The international implications of this mystical collapse extended far beyond Germany's borders, as diplomatic communications increasingly reflected supernatural rather than political considerations. Neutral countries received German proposals that made sense only within occult frameworks that foreign diplomats couldn't understand or take seriously. Military allies found themselves dealing with German commands and strategic assessments that seemed to have no connection to battlefield realities, making coordination increasingly difficult and ultimately impossible. The breakdown of rational communication accelerated Germany's isolation and contributed directly to the regime's final collapse. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this descent into magical thinking was its effect on millions of ordinary Germans who continued believing in mystical solutions long after their leaders had abandoned any pretense of rational governance. Popular faith in ancient prophecies and supernatural interventions persisted even as cities burned and armies retreated, sustained by cultural foundations that had been carefully constructed over more than a decade. The human cost of this mystical delusion was enormous, as resources desperately needed for civilian protection and military defense were instead devoted to occult research and ceremonial activities that served no practical purpose. People died while their leaders consulted astrologers about evacuation timing and searched ancient texts for magical formulas that might reverse military disasters. Yet even in the face of complete strategic collapse, the appeal of mystical thinking remained powerful enough to sustain hope among true believers who couldn't accept that their movement's fundamental assumptions about destiny and superiority might be false. The psychological investment in supernatural explanations had become too great to abandon, regardless of practical consequences. The final weeks of the Nazi regime witnessed a complete breakdown of the boundary between fantasy and reality, as mystical speculation became indistinguishable from official policy and supernatural beliefs guided decisions that affected millions of lives. This wasn't merely the product of individual delusion, but represented the logical conclusion of a systematic program to replace rational thinking with mystical alternatives. The bunker's final days demonstrated what happens when mystical thinking is taken to its ultimate extreme, creating a closed system where supernatural beliefs become self-reinforcing and immune to contradictory evidence. Within this system, military defeats could be reinterpreted as cosmic tests. Territorial losses could be explained as strategic withdrawals guided by ancient wisdom, and ultimate destruction could be viewed as necessary purification before mystical rebirth. This complete detachment from reality ultimately proved self-destructive, as leaders who might have negotiated surrender or organized evacuations instead remained paralyzed by mystical considerations that prevented effective action. The regime that had promised to harness supernatural forces for political purposes instead became their victim, destroyed by the very irrationality it had cultivated and encouraged. The psychological aftermath of this mystical collapse would influence German culture and politics for decades to come, creating lasting skepticism about the relationship between knowledge and authority, while simultaneously preserving fascination with alternative explanations for historical events. The ideas that had seemed so compelling during the regime's rise to power didn't simply disappear, but adapted to new circumstances and found new audiences in the post-war world. Understanding this transformation helps explain how mystical themes from the Nazi period continued to influence popular culture, conspiracy theories, and alternative history movements long after the regime itself had been defeated. The psychological appeal of secret knowledge and supernatural power proved more durable than the political movement that had originally promoted these ideas. The legacy of Nazi occultism thus extends far beyond its immediate historical context to reveal persistent human tendencies that continue to shape contemporary political and cultural movements. The specific symbols and stories may change, but the underlying psychological mechanisms remain remarkably consistent across different times and places. As we conclude this exploration of one of history's strangest chapters, the lessons learned from Nazi mystical thinking become more relevant than ever in an age of information abundance and institutional skepticism. The same psychological vulnerabilities that allowed occult ideas to flourish in 1930s. Germany continue to exist today, waiting for movements that understand how to exploit human desires for meaning, certainty, and special knowledge in times of crisis and uncertainty. The story of Nazi occultism ultimately serves as both historical documentation and contemporary warning, reminding us that the boundary between rational and mystical thinking is more fragile than we might prefer to believe. When that boundary breaks down, the consequences extend far beyond individual delusion, to reshape entire societies and determine the fate of millions of people who never chose to participate in the mystical experiment that ultimately consumed them. The strange saga of Nazi occultism didn't end with Hitler's death in his Berlin bunker. In fact, some of the most persistent mysteries surrounding the Third Reich's supernatural obsessions only deepened after Germany's surrender in May 1945. As Allied forces swept across occupied Europe, they discovered caches of artifacts, documents, and installations that revealed the true scope of Nazi mystical activities, while simultaneously giving birth to new legends that would captivate conspiracy theorists for generations to come. When American troops entered Wewelsburg Castle in April 1945, they found a scene that seemed lifted from a Gothic horror novel. The SS had attempted to destroy evidence of their activities, setting fires that damaged much of Himmler's carefully constructed mystical center. But enough remained to provide Allied investigators with their first comprehensive look at the scale of Nazi occult operations. The castle's library contained over 12,000 volumes on subjects ranging from medieval alchemy to Tibetan Buddhism, from Celtic mythology to ancient astronomy. Many of these books were annotated in Himmler's own handwriting, revealing his personal engagement with mystical ideas that went far beyond mere political manipulation. Intelligence officers photographed page after page of his notes, creating an archive that historians are still analysing today. More intriguing were the ceremonial objects discovered throughout the castle: elaborately carved wooden staffs, ornate chalices inscribed with runic symbols, and ritual daggers that showed signs of regular use, suggested that the SS had indeed conducted genuine occult ceremonies rather than merely studying mystical traditions. The physical evidence contradicted post-war claims by surviving Nazi officials that their interest in the occult had been purely academic or propagandistic. The castle's famous crypt presented investigators with their most puzzling discovery. The black sun symbol embedded in the floor had been partially damaged by the SS retreat, but enough remained to reveal its complex geometric design. More mysterious were the 12 stone pedestals arranged around the symbol's perimeter, each one carved with different runic inscriptions that scholars couldn't immediately decipher. Chemical analysis of stains on the altar-like structure in the crypt's center revealed traces of various organic compounds, including some that appeared to be of human origin. While investigators couldn't determine exactly what ceremonies had taken place in this underground chamber, the physical evidence suggested activities that went beyond simple meditation or symbolic ritual. Perhaps most disturbing were the personnel files discovered in the castle's administrative offices. These documents revealed that SS officers assigned to Wewelsburg underwent psychological evaluations designed to assess their receptivity to mystical thinking and their commitment to supernatural beliefs. The selection process wasn't looking for rational military leaders, but for individuals who could genuinely embrace the castle's occult atmosphere. The files also contained detailed records of the ceremonies conducted at Wewelsburg, including dates, participants, and ritual objectives. These weren't casual gatherings, but carefully planned events that followed elaborate protocols developed over years of experimentation. The documentation suggested a level of systematic occult practice that surprised even investigators who thought they understood the Nazi regime's mystical inclinations. Meanwhile, in occupied Austria, Allied forces made another significant discovery when they located the repositories where Nazi leaders had hidden their most prized artifacts. The famous Spear of Destiny, along with other Habsburg imperial regalia, was found in underground vaults, along with hundreds of other objects that had been collected for their supposed supernatural properties. The artifacts themselves told a fascinating story about Nazi collecting priorities. Alongside genuinely ancient relics were numerous medieval forgeries and modern reproductions that had been accepted as authentic by Nazi researchers. The collection revealed either remarkable gullibility or desperate wishful thinking among supposedly scholarly SS archaeologists. More troubling were the extensive files documenting the provenance of these objects. Many had been stolen from Jewish collectors, confiscated from museums in occupied territories, or acquired through coercive transactions with desperate sellers. The occult collection represented not just mystical obsession, but systematic cultural theft on an unprecedented scale. The post-war fate of these artifacts became its own source of mystery and speculation. While major pieces like the Spear of Destiny were returned to their original locations, hundreds of smaller objects disappeared during the chaotic months following Germany's surrender. Some were undoubtedly looted by souvenir-hunting soldiers. Others may have been deliberately hidden by SS officers planning for a mystical revival, and still others simply vanished into the black occult market for cult curiosities. This disappearance of Nazi occult artifacts gave birth to decades of treasure hunting and conspiracy theories about hidden caches waiting to be discovered. Popular culture embraced these mysteries, creating adventure stories about Nazi gold and mystical relics that continue to inspire movies and novels today. The line between documented history and romantic speculation became increasingly blurred as genuine wartime mysteries provided fertile ground for imaginative elaboration. The Allied investigation of Nazi occult activities faced unique challenges that conventional military intelligence wasn't equipped to handle. How do you evaluate the strategic significance of astrological charts? What threat assessment do you assign to ritual daggers and ceremonial robes? How do you interrogate prisoners whose worldview includes supernatural forces and cosmic destiny? Intelligence officers found themselves conducting interviews that read more like anthropological studies than standard military debriefings. Former SS officers would launch into elaborate explanations of runic symbolism or discuss ancient prophecies with the same seriousness they might once have applied to troop deployments and supply logistics. These interrogations revealed the genuine depth of mystical belief among Nazi leadership circles. While some officials clearly tried to distance themselves from occult activities after Germany's defeat, others remained convinced that supernatural forces had indeed influenced wartime events. They spoke of mysterious coincidences, unexplained phenomena, and spiritual experiences that had shaped their understanding of the war's meaning and outcome. The psychological profiles that emerged from these interviews painted a complex picture of how rational individuals could gradually embrace increasingly irrational beliefs. The process wasn't sudden conversion, but gradual acclimatization. As exposure to mystical ideas within prestigious institutional settings made supernatural thinking seem intellectually respectable and socially acceptable. One particularly revealing aspect of the post-war investigations involved tracking down the various expedition members and researchers who had participated in Nazi occult projects. Many of these individuals had been respected academics before the war, and their post-conflict careers revealed the lasting impact of their mystical experiences. Some expedition veterans continued pursuing occult research in civilian contexts, founding private organizations dedicated to studying ancient mysteries and supernatural phenomena. Others attempted to distance themselves from their wartime activities, but remained privately committed to mystical beliefs they had developed during their service with the Ahnenerbe. The most tragic cases involved researchers who had genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge through their work with Nazi occult projects. These individuals faced profound psychological crises when forced to confront the reality that their scholarly pursuits had served genocidal purposes and contributed to human suffering on an unimaginable scale. The Tibet expedition veterans proved particularly difficult to interview, as many remained convinced that they had indeed discovered evidence of advanced ancient civilizations and supernatural phenomena. Bruno Beger, the expedition's anthropologist, spent years after the war writing detailed accounts of his experiences that mixed genuine ethnographic observations with mystical speculation about Tibetan spiritual practices. These post-war memoirs and interviews created a substantial literature that influenced popular understanding of Nazi occult activities for decades to come. However, the accounts were often unreliable, as former participants had strong incentives to exaggerate their discoveries while minimizing their complicity in Nazi crimes. The challenge of separating fact from fiction in these testimonies reflects broader difficulties in studying Nazi occultism. The subject attracts individuals predisposed to believe in supernatural phenomena, while simultaneously repelling serious scholars who prefer to focus on more conventional aspects of Nazi history. This creates an information environment where sensational claims often receive more attention than careful analysis. Academic historians initially showed little interest in Nazi occult activities, dismissing them as peripheral curiosities that distracted from more important political and military developments. This scholarly neglect left the field open to amateur researchers and conspiracy theorists, who often lacked the methodological training necessary to evaluate evidence critically. The situation began changing in the 1960s and 1970s, as a new generation of historians recognized that understanding Nazi mystical thinking was crucial for comprehending how the regime maintained popular support and motivated extreme behaviors. These scholars brought rigorous analytical methods to bear on occult themes, separating documented facts from persistent myths, while acknowledging the genuine historical significance of supernatural beliefs within Nazi culture. Their research revealed that Nazi occultism wasn't a coherent system of beliefs, but rather a collection of overlapping, and sometimes contradictory ideas that served different purposes for different individuals. Some leaders used mystical themes purely for propaganda purposes. Others genuinely believed in supernatural forces, and still others fell somewhere between cynical manipulation and sincere conviction. This complexity explains why post-war accounts of Nazi occult activities often seem contradictory. Participants in the same events might remember them very differently depending on their personal level of mystical belief and their post-war psychological needs. The human tendency to rationalize past actions and maintain consistent self-images created additional layers of distortion in witness testimonies. The international dimension of post-war Nazi occult investigations proved equally complex. Allied intelligence services initially focused on potential security threats, worrying that mystical networks might serve as communication channels for underground Nazi resistance movements. However, most occult practitioners proved to be more interested in spiritual pursuits than political activism. More significant were the cultural influences that Nazi mystical thinking had already spread throughout occupied Europe. Local populations in conquered territories had been exposed to years of propaganda that presented occult ideas as legitimate scholarly positions. These influences didn't disappear when German armies retreated, but continued shaping popular attitudes toward ancient history, archaeological interpretation, and the relationship between science and supernatural belief. The post-war period also witnessed the emergence of new mystical movements that drew inspiration from Nazi occult themes while rejecting their political associations. These groups adopted symbols, practices, and historical narratives that had been developed within SS circles, but claimed to represent authentic ancient traditions rather than modern political innovations. This process of cultural appropriation created ongoing confusion about which occult ideas were genuinely ancient and which were Nazi inventions masquerading as traditional knowledge. The black sun symbol, for example, became popular among various mystical groups who believed they were connecting with primordial Germanic spirituality, unaware that the symbol had been created specifically for Wewelsburg Castle in the 1930s. The commercialization of Nazi occult mysteries began almost immediately after the war's end. As publishers recognized the market appeal of stories about supernatural Nazis and mystical artifacts, books, magazines, and eventually films exploited public fascination with the subject, while often prioritizing entertainment value over historical accuracy. This commercial exploitation created a feedback loop where sensational claims about Nazi occult activities gained credibility through repetition rather than evidence. Stories that appeared in popular magazines were cited by later authors as historical sources, gradually transforming speculation into accepted fact within certain communities. The entertainment industry's treatment of Nazi occultism reached its culmination in the Indiana Jones films of the 1980s, which crystallized popular imagination around the image of Nazi archaeologists seeking supernatural artifacts for military purposes. While these movies were obviously fictional, they reinforced cultural associations between Nazism and occultism that continue to influence public understanding of the subject. The persistent appeal of Nazi occult themes in popular culture reflects deeper psychological needs that extend far beyond historical curiosity. Stories about mystical Nazis tap into fundamental human fascinations with secret knowledge, hidden power, and the triumph of good over evil. They provide clear moral frameworks where supernatural forces ultimately ensure that justice prevails, even when conventional military and political methods seem inadequate. This psychological appeal helps explain why conspiracy theories about surviving Nazi occult networks remain popular decades after the war's end. The idea that mystical forces continue operating behind the scenes offers both explanation for contemporary problems and hope for eventual resolution through supernatural intervention. However, the romanticization of Nazi occultism in popular culture has had troubling consequences for historical understanding and contemporary political discourse. By focusing on mysterious artifacts and mystical ceremonies, these narratives often obscure the mundane bureaucratic processes through which genocide was planned and implemented. The emphasis on supernatural evil can make it harder to recognize how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary crimes. More dangerous is the way that popular fascination with Nazi mysticism can serve as a gateway for individuals who are initially attracted to occult themes, but gradually become exposed to underlying ideological content. The same psychological vulnerabilities that made mystical thinking appealing to 1930s, Germans continue to exist today, creating ongoing risks that extremist movements might exploit supernatural interests for political purposes. The academic study of Nazi occultism has evolved considerably since the immediate post-war period, developing sophisticated methodological approaches that can distinguish between different types of evidence and different levels of mystical commitment within Nazi circles. This scholarly work has produced a much more nuanced understanding of how supernatural beliefs functioned within the Third Reich's political and cultural systems historians recognize. Modern, that Nazi occultism wasn't simply a bizarre footnote to more serious political developments, but rather an integral component of how the regime understood itself and communicated with its supporters. The mystical themes weren't external additions to Nazi ideology, but rather emerged from the same psychological and cultural sources that made fascism appealing to millions of Europeans during the interwar period. This integration of occult analysis into mainstream historical scholarship has revealed important connections between Nazi mysticism and broader patterns of extremist thinking that continue to influence contemporary politics. The techniques used to promote supernatural beliefs within Nazi Germany bear striking resemblances to methods employed by modern conspiracy movements and alternative spirituality networks. Understanding these historical precedents becomes increasingly important as digital communication technologies create new opportunities for spreading mystical ideas and building communities around supernatural beliefs. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Nazi occult themes to gain widespread acceptance during the 1930s and 1940s continue to operate today, though they now function through different media and institutional structures. The lessons learned from studying Nazi mysticism extend far beyond historical curiosity to provide practical insights for recognizing and responding to contemporary forms of extremist recruitment and ideological manipulation. By understanding how rational individuals can gradually embrace irrational beliefs when those beliefs are presented within prestigious institutional contexts and reinforced through community belonging, we can better identify similar processes in our own time and place. The story of Nazi occultism ultimately reveals both the power and the danger of human desires for transcendence, meaning, and special knowledge. These psychological needs aren't inherently problematic, but they become dangerous when exploited by movements that promise supernatural solutions to political problems while demanding absolute loyalty to charismatic leaders and exclusive ideological systems. As we conclude this exploration of one of history's strangest chapters, the most important insight may be recognizing that the boundary between rational and mystical thinking is more permeable than most people realize. Under the right circumstances, with sufficient social pressure and institutional support, almost anyone can be led to embrace beliefs that they would normally consider absurd or impossible. The Nazi experiment with occult politics failed catastrophically, destroying the very people it claimed to serve while causing immeasurable suffering for millions of innocent victims. But the psychological vulnerabilities that made this experiment possible didn't disappear with Germany's military defeat. They remain part of human nature, waiting for new movements that understand how to exploit our deepest desires for meaning and transcendence in service of their own destructive purposes. The ultimate lesson of Nazi occultism isn't that mystical thinking is inherently evil, but rather that any belief system becomes dangerous when it places itself beyond rational criticism and demands absolute commitment from its followers. Whether those beliefs involve ancient artifacts, cosmic forces, or supernatural destiny matters less than the psychological and social mechanisms through which they gain power over human hearts and minds. In our contemporary world, where information abundance and institutional skepticism create new opportunities for alternative belief systems to flourish, understanding these historical precedents becomes more crucial than ever. The specific symbols and stories may change, but the underlying human vulnerabilities remain constant, requiring vigilance and wisdom to prevent their exploitation by those who would use our highest aspirations to serve their lowest purposes. The haunting chambers of Wewelsburg Castle still echo with the footsteps of tourists who come seeking glimpses of history's darkest mysteries. The black sun symbol remains embedded in the crypt's floor, a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for both transcendent yearning and destructive delusion. The artifacts collected by Nazi occultists rest in museums and private collections, their supposed supernatural powers long since revealed as projections of human hope and fear. But the deeper mysteries surrounding Nazi mysticism persist, not because they involve genuine supernatural phenomena, but because they illuminate aspects of human psychology that we still struggle to understand and control. In studying the strange saga of occult Nazism, we encounter not just historical curiosities, but fundamental questions about the nature of belief, the psychology of power, and the eternal human search for meaning in an uncertain world. These questions remain as relevant today as they were in the darkened halls where SS officers once gathered to contemplate their cosmic destiny. The answers we discover through careful historical analysis won't solve all contemporary problems, but they may help us recognize when our own highest aspirations are being manipulated by those who understand the dangerous power of promising supernatural solutions to earthly challenges. The story continues, not in hidden bunkers or mystical castles, but in the ongoing human struggle to balance our need for transcendent meaning with our responsibility to remain grounded in evidence, compassion, and respect for the dignity of all people. In that struggle, the lessons learned from Nazi occultism serve not as entertainment, but as warning, not as mystery, but as revelation of truths we ignore at our peril. The final chapter of our journey through Nazi occultism brings us to perhaps the most chilling realization of all: how these mystical obsessions didn't simply vanish with Germany's surrender, but transformed and adapted, finding new expressions in the decades that followed. The ideas that had seemed so compelling during the regime's darkest hours proved remarkably resilient, morphing into new forms that continue to influence our world today. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied investigators discovered something they hadn't expected. The Nazi occult network wasn't simply a collection of individual enthusiasts, but a sophisticated system of beliefs and practices that had put down deep roots throughout German society. Schools, universities, publishing houses, and cultural organizations had all been subtly influenced by mystical thinking in ways that wouldn't disappear overnight. Teachers who had spent years incorporating runic symbolism into their lessons didn't suddenly abandon these practices when new textbooks arrived. Publishers who had built successful businesses around ancient mystery books continued serving audiences hungry for supernatural explanations. Film studios that had mastered the art of mystical adventure stories found eager markets in countries that had never experienced Nazi rule directly. The denazification process that swept through Germany in the late 1940s focused primarily on obvious political content, leaving mystical themes largely untouched. Officials recognized the danger of Nazi political ideology, but struggled to identify the subtler influences of occult thinking that had become woven into popular culture and educational systems. This oversight had profound consequences for how Nazi mystical ideas spread beyond Germany's borders. Cultural exports like films, books, and academic papers carried occult themes to international audiences who had no awareness of their ideological origins. What had once been tools of Nazi propaganda became sources of entertainment and scholarly speculation in countries around the world. The process wasn't deliberate cultural imperialism, but rather the natural result of how ideas travel through networks of communication and exchange. A German archaeological theory about ancient Aryan migrations might influence a British anthropologist's research, which could then shape an American museum exhibit, which might inspire a Hollywood adventure film that reaches audiences across multiple continents. Each step in this transmission process diluted the original political content, while preserving the underlying mystical assumptions. By the time these ideas reached their final destinations, they often appeared to be neutral scholarly positions or harmless entertainment rather than recycled Nazi propaganda. The entertainment industry played a particularly crucial role in this transformation. Adventure stories about archaeological expeditions and ancient mysteries proved enormously popular with audiences seeking escapist entertainment after the war's devastation. Publishers and filmmakers discovered that mystical themes could be easily separated from their Nazi origins while retaining their psychological appeal. The result was a flowering of popular culture that borrowed heavily from Nazi occult imagery and narratives while claiming to represent universal human interests in mystery and adventure. Ancient astronaut theories, lost civilization speculation, and treasure hunting stories all drew inspiration from research programs that had originally been designed to validate Nazi racial theories. This cultural recycling created a peculiar situation where ideas that had once served genocidal purposes became sources of innocent entertainment for millions of people who had no awareness of their dark origins. The same mystical themes that had helped justify mass murder were now helping sell movie tickets and paperback novels. The academic world faced its own challenges in dealing with Nazi occult legacies. Universities that had collaborated with Ahnenerbe research programs needed to distance themselves from their wartime activities while preserving valuable scholarly resources and institutional reputations. This created strong incentives to minimize the significance of mystical influences and emphasize the purely scientific aspects of Nazi-sponsored research. Many professors and researchers who had participated in occult projects simply continued their work under new institutional arrangements, often without acknowledging their previous affiliations. Archaeological expeditions that had once searched for evidence of Aryan superiority were reframed as studies of ancient civilizations. Anthropological research that had supported racial hierarchies became investigations of human cultural diversity. This institutional continuity meant that scholarly networks that had been established during the Nazi period remained largely intact after the war. Researchers continued collaborating, sharing ideas, and building upon each other's work, even when the political context that had originally brought them together had disappeared. The psychological mechanisms that had made Nazi mysticism appealing to educated professionals didn't vanish with Germany's defeat. The desire for special knowledge, the appeal of hidden truths, and the satisfaction of belonging to an elite community of initiates remained as powerful as ever. New mystical movements arose to satisfy these needs, often drawing inspiration from Nazi occult themes while rejecting their political associations. The New Age movement that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s borrowed extensively from Nazi mystical concepts, including beliefs about ancient advanced civilizations, the spiritual significance of archaeological sites, and the existence of hidden knowledge that could transform human consciousness. Most New Age practitioners had no awareness of these connections and would have been horrified to learn about the Nazi origins of many ideas they considered spiritually enlightening. This unconscious transmission of Nazi occult themes reveals something important about how extremist ideas can outlive the political movements that created them. By separating mystical content from its original context and presenting it as universal wisdom or scientific discovery, these ideas could appeal to audiences who would never have accepted them in their original form. The process wasn't unique to occult themes, but reflected broader patterns of how Nazi innovations were absorbed into post-war culture. Technological advances developed for military purposes found civilian applications. Organizational techniques pioneered by Nazi institutions influenced business and educational practices. Even architectural styles associated with the regime appeared in modified forms throughout the Western world. However, the transmission of mystical ideas proved particularly troubling because of their psychological power and resistance to rational criticism. Unlike technological innovations that could be evaluated based on practical effectiveness, mystical beliefs operated in realms where evidence and logic had limited authority. This made them especially difficult to identify and counter when they appeared in new contexts. The challenge became even more complex as digital communication technologies created new opportunities for spreading mystical ideas and building communities around supernatural beliefs. The internet allowed individuals with shared interests in ancient mysteries and occult knowledge to find each other and reinforce their convictions, regardless of geographical distance or institutional affiliation. Online forums, social media groups, and video sharing platforms became vehicles for transmitting ideas that had originated in Nazi occult circles, often without any acknowledgement or awareness of their historical origins. A YouTube video about ancient Aryan civilizations might reach thousands of viewers who had no idea they were consuming recycled Nazi propaganda. The democratization of information distribution that characterizes our digital age has many benefits, but it also creates vulnerabilities that extremist movements have learned to exploit. The same technologies that allow legitimate scholars to share research and educators to reach global audiences can also be used to spread misinformation and recruit individuals to dangerous ideologies. Understanding these patterns becomes crucial for recognizing how historical forms of extremism adapt to contemporary circumstances. The specific political content may change, but the underlying psychological appeals and recruitment strategies often remain remarkably consistent across different times and places. The persistence of Nazi occult themes in popular culture also reflects deeper human needs that extend beyond mere entertainment or intellectual curiosity. Stories about ancient mysteries and hidden knowledge provide meaning and purpose to people struggling with uncertainty and powerlessness in their daily lives. They offer hope that reality contains more possibilities than conventional wisdom suggests. These psychological needs aren't inherently problematic, but they become dangerous when exploited by movements that promise supernatural solutions while demanding absolute loyalty to charismatic leaders and exclusive belief systems. The same yearning for transcendence that can inspire great art and scientific discovery can also make individuals vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand how to weaponize human spiritual aspirations. The Nazi experiment with occult politics demonstrated both the power and the peril of attempts to harness mystical thinking for political purposes. While these efforts ultimately failed catastrophically, they revealed psychological vulnerabilities that remain part of human nature and continue to create opportunities for extremist recruitment and ideological manipulation. Contemporary conspiracy movements and alternative spirituality networks often employ techniques that bear striking resemblances to methods used by Nazi occult practitioners. The promise of secret knowledge, the creation of exclusive communities, the demonization of mainstream institutions, and the gradual escalation of commitment to increasingly radical beliefs all follow patterns that were perfected during the Third Reich's mystical experiments. Recognizing these patterns doesn't require abandoning all forms of spiritual or mystical thinking, but it does demand greater awareness of how such beliefs can be manipulated for harmful purposes. The goal isn't to eliminate mystery from human experience, but rather to maintain healthy skepticism about claims that require absolute faith and unquestioning obedience. The story of Nazi occultism ultimately serves as both historical documentation and contemporary warning. It reminds us that the human capacity for self-deception is virtually unlimited when powerful incentives reward particular conclusions, and that even the most educated and sophisticated individuals can be led to embrace beliefs that serve destructive purposes. As we navigate our own age of information abundance and institutional skepticism, The lessons learned from this strange chapter of history become more relevant than ever. The specific symbols and stories may change, but the underlying human vulnerabilities remain constant, requiring vigilance and wisdom to prevent their exploitation by those who would use our highest aspirations to serve their lowest purposes. The chambers of Wewelsburg may be empty now. The expeditions to distant lands may be over, and the artifacts may rest silently in museum storage rooms. But the deeper mysteries that drew so many intelligent people into the Nazi occult web continue to exert their pull on human imagination and desire. Our challenge isn't to solve these mysteries once and for all, but rather to engage with them in ways that honor our need for meaning while protecting our commitment to truth, compassion, and human dignity. In that ongoing struggle between mystery and reality, between transcendence and responsibility, the lessons of Nazi occultism offer guidance that extends far beyond historical curiosity. They remind us that the price of wisdom is eternal vigilance, not just against obvious enemies, but against the subtle corruption of our own deepest longings and most noble aspirations. The story ends where it began, with questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between belief and evidence, between our individual search for meaning and our collective responsibility for justice. These questions don't have simple answers, but asking them honestly and courageously may be the best protection we have against repeating the mistakes of those who sought supernatural solutions to human problems and found only darkness where they had hoped to discover light. The echoes of that mystical obsession didn't simply fade with the fall of Berlin. Instead, they transformed into something perhaps even more insidious, a cultural legacy that would quietly reshape how entire generations understood the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern power. In the months following Germany's surrender, something remarkable happened in the world of academic publishing. University presses across Europe and America began releasing a flood of books about ancient civilizations, mysterious archaeological discoveries, and lost knowledge, traditions. On the surface, these publications appeared to represent legitimate scholarly interest in humanity's forgotten past. But when you examine their footnotes and bibliographies closely, a disturbing pattern emerges. Many of these post-war academic works drew heavily on research that had been conducted under Ahnenerbe sponsorship, often without acknowledging their Nazi origins. Studies of ancient migration patterns, theories about advanced prehistoric civilizations, and speculation about the spiritual practices of early European peoples all bore the subtle fingerprints of SS scholarship, repackaged for respectable academic consumption. The process wasn't necessarily conscious collaboration with Nazi ideology. Rather, it reflected the complex reality of how ideas travel through intellectual networks. A French archaeologist might cite a German colleague's pre-war paper about Celtic religious practices, unaware that the research had been funded by Himmler's organization and shaped by racial theories. An American anthropologist might build upon linguistic studies that had originally been designed to prove Aryan superiority, seeing only interesting insights about ancient language families. This intellectual contamination created a feedback loop that would influence scholarly discourse for decades. Theories that had been developed to support Nazi racial ideology found new life as seemingly neutral academic positions, gradually becoming incorporated into mainstream historical and archaeological thinking. The mystical assumptions that had once served genocidal purposes were now helping shape how university students learned about human civilization's earliest chapters. The entertainment industry proved even more receptive to these recycled mystical themes. Hollywood discovered that audiences had an apparently insatiable appetite for adventure stories featuring archaeological expeditions, ancient mysteries, and supernatural artifacts. What the film industry didn't advertise was how many of these narratives drew inspiration directly from Nazi occult projects and expeditions. The treasure-hunting adventures that became staples of popular cinema often followed plot structures that mirrored actual Ahnenerbe missions. Teams of intrepid researchers would travel to exotic locations, decipher ancient symbols, and uncover powerful relics while competing against shadowy antagonists. These stories provided thrilling entertainment, while unconsciously normalizing the idea that archaeological research was primarily about finding mystical objects rather than understanding human cultures. Television programming embraced similar themes through documentary series that presented ancient mysteries as unsolved puzzles, waiting for modern investigators. These shows often featured dramatic reenactments of archaeological discoveries, interviews with researchers making extraordinary claims, and speculation about advanced technologies possessed by prehistoric civilizations. The format created an aura of scientific legitimacy around ideas that would have seemed absurd in purely fictional contexts. The psychological appeal of these programs lay in their promise that reality contained hidden depths accessible only to those with special knowledge and determination. Viewers could participate vicariously in the excitement of discovery while feeling part of an enlightened community that understood truths hidden from the masses. The same emotional rewards that had once motivated SS officers now served to build television audiences and sell advertising space. Book publishing followed similar patterns, with entire genres emerging around ancient astronaut theories, lost civilization speculation, and alternative archaeology. These publications often featured impressive photographs of mysterious artifacts, detailed maps of unexplained archaeological sites, and scholarly-sounding discussions of evidence that mainstream academics supposedly ignored or suppressed. The authors of these books weren't necessarily aware of their intellectual debt to Nazi occult research, but the connections were unmistakable to anyone familiar with Ahnenerbe publications. The same sites that SS expeditions had investigated in the 1930s became focal points for post-war mystery writers. The same theoretical frameworks that had once supported racial hierarchies now provided structure for speculation about ancient advanced civilizations. This publishing phenomenon created a parallel intellectual universe where alternative theories about human history could flourish without the constraints of conventional academic peer review. Readers who found mainstream historical accounts boring or incomplete could discover exciting alternatives that promised hidden knowledge and revolutionary insights. The psychological satisfaction was enormous, even when the actual evidence was minimal or non-existent. Educational systems struggled to respond to this flood of mystical content, masquerading as scholarship. Teachers found themselves fielding questions from students who had encountered alternative theories through popular media and wanted to know why their textbooks didn't discuss ancient astronauts or lost Atlantean technologies. The challenge wasn't simply correcting misinformation, but addressing the underlying appeal of mystical explanations for historical mysteries. Some educators attempted to incorporate discussions of these alternative theories into their curricula, hoping to teach critical thinking skills by examining why certain ideas appealed to popular imagination despite lacking scientific support. However, this approach often backfired by giving mystical theories additional credibility through academic attention, even when that attention was critical. The internet age accelerated these trends exponentially, creating new platforms for sharing mystical content and building communities around alternative historical theories. Online forums allowed enthusiasts to share research, debate interpretations, and reinforce each other's convictions without interference from skeptical authorities. Video sharing websites enabled anyone with editing software to create documentary-style presentations that could reach global audiences instantly. The democratization of information distribution had many positive effects, but it also created unprecedented opportunities for spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories. The same technologies that allowed legitimate researchers to share their findings also enabled individuals with minimal qualifications to present themselves as experts on ancient mysteries and hidden knowledge. Social media platforms amplified these effects by creating algorithms that showed users content similar to what they had previously engaged with. Someone who watched a video about mysterious archaeological discoveries might soon find their feed filled with increasingly exotic theories about ancient civilizations, alien visitors, and suppressed historical truths. The technology was designed to maximize user engagement, not to promote accurate information or critical thinking. This digital ecosystem proved particularly effective at recruiting individuals who felt alienated from mainstream institutions and attracted to alternative explanations for complex phenomena. The promise of special knowledge accessible only to those willing to question official narratives provided psychological benefits that rational analysis couldn't match. Users could feel simultaneously enlightened and rebellious, part of an elite community that understood hidden truths. The recruitment process often followed predictable patterns that bore striking resemblances to techniques used by Nazi occult practitioners. Initial exposure would come through apparently harmless content about historical mysteries or archaeological anomalies. Gradual escalation would introduce more exotic theories and conspiracy-minded interpretations. Eventually, some individuals would encounter explicitly extremist content that used mystical themes to promote political ideologies. Contemporary conspiracy movements have learned to exploit these pathways with sophisticated understanding of how mystical thinking can serve as a gateway to more dangerous beliefs. Ancient astronaut theories might lead to speculation about hidden elites controlling human civilization. Lost civilization narratives might evolve into theories about racial hierarchies and genetic superiority. Archaeological mysteries might become evidence for grand conspiracies suppressing important truths. The process isn't automatic or inevitable, but the psychological mechanisms involved are remarkably consistent across different contexts and time periods. The same human needs for meaning, belonging, and special knowledge that made Nazi occultism appealing during the 1930s continue to create vulnerabilities that extremist movements can exploit today. Understanding these patterns becomes crucial for recognizing how historical forms of mystical thinking continue to influence contemporary culture and politics. The specific content may evolve, but the underlying appeal of hidden knowledge and alternative explanations remains constant across generations and cultural contexts. The challenge for educators, media professionals, and civic leaders isn't to eliminate all forms of mystery and speculation from human discourse, but rather to promote approaches to unknown phenomena that maintain healthy skepticism while respecting genuine curiosity about the world's complexities. This requires developing cultural literacy about how mystical thinking functions and why it can be both inspiring and dangerous depending on the context in which it operates. The legacy of Nazi occultism thus extends far beyond historical curiosity to illuminate ongoing struggles between evidence-based reasoning and wishful thinking, between legitimate scholarly inquiry and ideologically motivated research, between healthy mystery and dangerous delusion. These struggles play out daily in classrooms, media presentations, and online discussions where the descendants of SS mystical thinking compete with rational analysis for influence over human understanding. The story continues, not in ancient castles or remote expeditions, but in the contemporary battleground over how we understand the relationship between past and present, between knowledge and belief, between individual curiosity and collective responsibility. In that ongoing struggle, the lessons learned from studying Nazi mysticism provide essential guidance for navigating the complex landscape of information, misinformation, and the eternal human search for meaning in an uncertain world. The artifacts may rest silently in their display cases, the expeditions may be documented only in fading photographs, and the ceremonies may exist only in historical accounts. But the psychological forces that once drew intelligent people into mystical delusion remain as powerful as ever, waiting for new movements that understand how to harness human spiritual aspirations for purposes that their victims would never consciously choose to support. Our journey through the shadowy corridors of Nazi mysticism brings us to a crossroads where documented history meets persistent legend, where the artifacts discovered in bombed-out bunkers tell only part of a story that continues to evolve decades after the last shots were fired. When Allied investigators first opened the sealed vaults beneath Berlin in the spring of 1945, they expected to find military documents and stolen treasures. What they discovered instead was something far more unsettling. Entire rooms filled with carefully catalogued collections of medieval manuscripts, ancient symbols carved into stone tablets, and ceremonial objects that seemed more appropriate for a museum of world religions than the headquarters of a modern military organization. The sheer scope of these collections revealed the systematic nature of Nazi mystical interests. These weren't casual acquisitions or random souvenirs from conquered territories. Instead, they represented years of careful research, deliberate acquisition, and methodical organization according to classification systems that prioritized supernatural significance over historical value or artistic merit. Each artifact bore detailed documentation describing its alleged powers, historical associations, and ritual applications. SS researchers had created elaborate filing systems that cross-referenced objects according to their supposed mystical properties, their connections to ancient Germanic traditions, and their potential utility in ceremonial contexts. The bureaucratic precision applied to these supernatural inventories was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Among the most intriguing discoveries were detailed plans for ceremonies that had never been conducted, elaborate rituals designed for future implementation when circumstances might permit their full realization. These documents revealed that Nazi mystical thinking extended far beyond wartime expeditions and castle gatherings to encompass long-term visions of a society organized around occult principles and supernatural beliefs. The ceremonial plans included architectural drawings for temples that were never built, detailed scripts for rituals that were never performed, and organizational charts for mystical hierarchies that were never fully implemented. These materials suggested that leading Nazis saw their wartime activities as merely the preliminary phase of a much grander project to reshape human civilization according to occult principles. What made these discoveries particularly fascinating was how they revealed the intersection between genuine scholarly research and complete fantasy within Nazi institutional structures. The same filing cabinets contained rigorous archaeological reports alongside documents describing communication with supernatural entities. Careful scientific measurements of ancient artifacts sat next to elaborate theories about their mystical properties and ceremonial applications. This combination of methodical precision and mystical speculation created a unique form of institutional culture where rational analysis and supernatural belief reinforced each other rather than competing for authority. Nazi researchers could employ sophisticated techniques while pursuing objectives that had no basis in empirical reality, creating impressive documentation around completely imaginary phenomena. The psychological profiles that emerged from interviewing the collectors and curators of these mystical archives revealed individuals who genuinely believed they were preserving humanity's most important spiritual treasures. Many seemed convinced that future generations would thank them for safeguarding ancient wisdom that mainstream institutions had ignored or actively suppressed. These interviews provided crucial insights into how intelligent, educated individuals could gradually embrace increasingly irrational beliefs when those beliefs were presented within prestigious institutional contexts and reinforced through community belonging. The process wasn't sudden conversion, but gradual acclimatization to ideas that would have seemed absurd in different circumstances. The post-war fate of these mystical collections became its own source of mystery and speculation. While major artifacts were catalogued and transferred to appropriate museums or returned to their countries of origin, thousands of smaller objects simply vanished during the chaotic months following Germany's surrender. Some disappeared into private collections, others were destroyed in bombing raids, and still others were deliberately hidden by individuals who hoped to preserve them for future mystical revival. This disappearance of Nazi occult materials created a thriving black market for supernatural artifacts and esoteric documents that persisted for decades after the war's end. Collectors, researchers, and curiosity seekers competed to acquire objects that might have once resided in SS ceremonial chambers or Ahnenerbe research facilities, often paying enormous sums for items of questionable authenticity. The market demand for Nazi mystical artifacts led to widespread forgery and fraud, as enterprising individuals created fake relics to satisfy collector appetite for supernatural objects with dramatic historical provenance. Medieval manuscripts were artificially aged and marked with SS symbols. Ceremonial daggers were manufactured with runic inscriptions, and ordinary stones were transformed into mystical artifacts through creative storytelling about their supposed Nazi connections. This proliferation of fake Nazi occult materials created additional confusion about which artifacts were genuinely historical and which were modern fabrications designed to exploit popular fascination with mystical themes. The line between authentic historical objects and commercial exploitation became increasingly blurred as legitimate museums competed with private collectors and amateur enthusiasts for access to materials of uncertain provenance. Meanwhile, the intellectual foundations that had supported Nazi mystical thinking proved remarkably adaptable to new political and cultural contexts. The same theoretical frameworks that had once justified racial hierarchies found new applications in Cold War conspiracy theories, counterculture spirituality movements, and contemporary alternative history speculation. Academic institutions that had collaborated with Nazi mystical research programs faced complex challenges in dealing with their wartime legacies. Universities needed to distance themselves from obvious ideological contamination while preserving valuable scholarly resources and maintaining institutional credibility. This created strong incentives to minimize the significance of mystical influences and emphasize the purely scientific aspects of Nazi-sponsored research. Many professors and researchers who had participated in Ahnenerbe projects simply continued their work under new institutional arrangements, often without acknowledging their previous affiliations or examining how their wartime experiences might have influenced their scholarly perspectives. Archaeological theories, anthropological frameworks, and historical interpretations that had been developed within Nazi institutional contexts were quietly incorporated into mainstream academic discourse. This intellectual continuity meant that ideas which had originally been designed to support Nazi ideology continued to influence scholarly research and popular understanding long after their political origins had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. The process wasn't necessarily conscious collaboration with extremist thinking, but rather reflected the complex ways that intellectual networks preserve and transmit knowledge across different political contexts. The entertainment industry proved even more receptive to recycled Nazi mystical themes, discovering that audiences had an apparently insatiable appetite for adventure stories featuring archaeological expeditions, ancient mysteries, and supernatural artifacts. Hollywood producers found that mystical elements originally developed for Nazi propaganda purposes could be easily separated from their political context and repackaged as exciting entertainment for mass consumption. Adventure films of the 1950s and 1960s routinely featured plot elements that had been directly inspired by actual Ahnenerbe expeditions and SS research projects. Treasure hunting adventures, lost civilization discoveries, and ancient artifact recoveries all drew heavily on Nazi mystical narratives while presenting themselves as purely fictional entertainment with no connection to historical events. This cultural appropriation created a peculiar situation where ideas that had once served genocidal purposes became sources of innocent entertainment for millions of viewers who had no awareness of their dark origins. The psychological mechanisms that had made Nazi mysticism appealing to German audiences during the 1930s now served to build box office receipts and television ratings in countries that had fought against Nazi Germany. Television programming embraced similar themes through documentary series that presented ancient mysteries as unsolved puzzles waiting for modern investigation. These shows often featured dramatic reenactments of archaeological discoveries, interviews with researchers, making extraordinary claims, and speculation about advanced technologies possessed by prehistoric civilizations. The format created an aura of scientific legitimacy around ideas that had originated in SS research facilities and Ahnenerbe expedition reports. The publishing industry followed comparable patterns, with entire genres emerging around alternative archaeology, lost civilization theories, and ancient astronaut speculation. These books often featured impressive photographs of mysterious artifacts, detailed maps of unexplained archaeological sites, and scholarly-sounding discussions of evidence that mainstream academics supposedly ignored or actively suppressed. The authors of these publications weren't necessarily aware of their intellectual debt to Nazi occult research, but the connections were unmistakable to anyone familiar with Ahnenerbe publications and SS theoretical frameworks. The same sites that had been investigated by Nazi expeditions became focal points for post-war mystery writers. The same interpretive approaches that had once supported racial theories now provided structure for speculation about ancient advanced civilizations and extraterrestrial influences on human development. This parallel intellectual universe created spaces where alternative theories about human history could flourish without the constraints of conventional academic peer review or empirical verification. Readers who found mainstream historical accounts boring or incomplete could discover exciting alternatives that promised hidden knowledge and revolutionary insights about humanity's forgotten past. The psychological satisfaction provided by these alternative narratives was enormous, offering audiences the excitement of discovery, combined with the satisfaction of possessing special knowledge unavailable to the uninitiated masses. The same emotional rewards that had once motivated SS officers to participate in mystical ceremonies now served to build loyal readerships for books and television programs that promised access to suppressed historical truths. Educational systems struggled to respond effectively to this flood of mystical content masquerading as legitimate scholarship. Teachers found themselves fielding questions from students who had encountered alternative theories through popular media and wanted to know why their textbooks didn't discuss ancient astronauts, lost Atlantean technologies, or suppressed archaeological discoveries that supposedly revealed humanity's true origins. The challenge wasn't simply correcting factual misinformation, but addressing the underlying psychological appeal of mystical explanations for historical mysteries. Students who had been exposed to alternative theories often found conventional historical accounts disappointingly mundane compared to exciting narratives about ancient advanced civilizations and supernatural interventions in human affairs. Some educators attempted to incorporate critical analysis of alternative theories into their curricula, hoping to teach students how to evaluate extraordinary claims and distinguish between legitimate scholarly research and pseudoscientific speculation. However, this approach often proved counterproductive by giving mystical theories additional credibility through academic attention, even when that attention was explicitly critical. The internet age dramatically accelerated these trends by creating new platforms for sharing mystical content and building communities around alternative historical theories. Online forums allowed enthusiasts to collaborate on research projects, debate interpretations of ancient artifacts, and reinforce each other's convictions without interference from skeptical authorities or institutional gatekeepers. Video sharing websites enabled individuals with minimal qualifications to create professional-looking documentary presentations that could reach global audiences instantly. The same production techniques that had once required expensive studio equipment and broadcasting infrastructure were now available to anyone with basic computer skills and internet access. Social media platforms amplified these effects through recommendation algorithms that showed users content similar to what they had previously engaged with, creating echo chambers where alternative theories could flourish without exposure to contradictory evidence or critical analysis. Someone who watched a video about mysterious archaeological discoveries might soon find their feed filled with increasingly exotic theories about ancient civilizations, hidden knowledge, and suppressed historical truths. This digital ecosystem proved particularly effective at recruiting individuals who felt alienated from mainstream institutions and attracted to alternative explanations for complex phenomena. the promise of special knowledge accessible only to those willing to question official narratives, provided psychological benefits that conventional education and entertainment couldn't match. The recruitment process often followed predictable patterns that bore striking resemblances to techniques that had been perfected by Nazi mystical practitioners decades earlier. Initial exposure would come through apparently harmless content about historical mysteries or archaeological anomalies. Gradual escalation would introduce more exotic theories and conspiracy-minded interpretations of conventional historical accounts. Contemporary movements have learned to exploit these pathways with sophisticated understanding of how mystical thinking can serve as a gateway to more explicitly ideological content. Ancient civilization theories might evolve into speculation about hidden elites controlling human development. Archaeological mysteries might become evidence for grand conspiracies, suppressing important truths about human potential and cosmic significance. The transformation isn't automatic or inevitable, but the psychological mechanisms involved remain remarkably consistent across different historical contexts and cultural settings. The same human needs for meaning, belonging, and special knowledge that had made Nazi occultism appealing during the 1930s continue to create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by contemporary movements seeking to recruit followers and promote alternative worldviews. Understanding these historical patterns becomes crucial for recognizing how mystical themes continue to influence contemporary culture and politics in ways that extend far beyond obvious extremist organizations. The legacy of Nazi occult thinking persists not through direct ideological transmission, but through the preservation and adaptation of psychological techniques that proved effective at attracting intelligent individuals to irrational beliefs. The challenge for educators, media professionals, and civic leaders involves developing approaches to mystery and speculation that honor genuine human curiosity while maintaining healthy skepticism about extraordinary claims. This requires cultural literacy about how mystical thinking functions and why it can be both inspiring and dangerous depending on the institutional contexts in which it operates. The artifacts may rest quietly in their museum cases, the expeditions may exist only in fading photographs, and the ceremonies may be documented only in historical archives. But the psychological forces that once drew respectable scholars and dedicated researchers into elaborate mystical delusions remain as powerful as ever, waiting for new movements that understand how to harness human spiritual aspirations for purposes that serve narrow ideological objectives rather than genuine human flourishing. The story continues, not in remote castles or exotic expedition sites, but in the contemporary struggle to balance legitimate wonder about historical mysteries with responsible approaches to evidence and interpretation. In that ongoing challenge, the lessons learned from studying Nazi mystical thinking provide essential guidance for navigating the complex landscape where entertainment, education, and ideology intersect in ways that can either enrich human understanding or lead us down paths we never intended to follow. Our exploration of Nazi occultism brings us to one final revelation that may be the most unsettling of all: how these mystical obsessions didn't simply vanish into history, but quietly infiltrated the very foundations of how we understand ancient civilizations and archaeological discovery today. In the decades following the war, something remarkable happened in universities across the Western world. Professors who had never set foot in Germany began incorporating theories about advanced prehistoric civilizations into their lectures. Archaeological textbooks started featuring speculation about lost technologies and ancient wisdom traditions. Museum exhibits began presenting alternative interpretations of artifacts that emphasized their mysterious properties over their cultural contexts. This wasn't conscious collaboration with Nazi ideology, but rather the natural result of how academic ideas travel through networks of scholarly communication. A British archaeologist might cite a German colleague's research on Celtic religious practices, unaware that the original study had been funded by the Ahnenerbe and shaped by racial theories. An American anthropologist might build upon linguistic research that had originally been designed to prove Aryan superiority, seeing only fascinating insights about ancient language development. The process created a kind of intellectual contamination that spread through the global academic community, like an invisible contagion. Ideas that had been developed to support genocidal policies found new life as seemingly neutral scholarly positions, gradually becoming incorporated into mainstream historical and archaeological thinking without anyone recognizing their toxic origins. What makes this transformation particularly fascinating is how it reveals the remarkable adaptability of mystical thinking when separated from its original political context. The same theoretical frameworks that had once justified mass murder could be repackaged as exciting discoveries about humanity's forgotten past, appealing to entirely different audiences for completely different reasons. Consider how many popular documentaries about ancient civilizations follow narrative structures that were pioneered by Nazi propaganda films. Teams of intrepid researchers travel to remote locations, decipher mysterious symbols, and uncover evidence of advanced technologies that mainstream science supposedly ignores. The format creates an aura of scientific legitimacy around speculation that often has no basis in evidence. Television producers discovered that audiences had an apparently insatiable appetite for programs that promised to reveal hidden truths about human origins and ancient achievements. What these producers didn't advertise was how many of their most compelling narratives drew inspiration directly from Nazi expedition reports and Ahnenerbe research projects. The psychological appeal of these programs lies in their promise that reality contains secret depths, accessible only to those with special knowledge and determination. Viewers can participate vicariously in the excitement of discovery while feeling part of an enlightened community that understands truths hidden from the uninitiated masses. It's the same emotional satisfaction that once motivated SS officers to spend their evenings studying runic inscriptions and planning mystical ceremonies. Book publishers embraced similar themes with equal enthusiasm, creating entire genres around lost civilization theories, alternative archaeology, and ancient mystery speculation. These publications often featured impressive photographs of unexplained artifacts, detailed maps of mysterious archaeological sites, and scholarly-sounding discussions of evidence that academic institutions supposedly suppress or ignore. The authors weren't necessarily aware of their intellectual debt to Nazi occult research, but the connections were unmistakable to anyone familiar with Ahnenerbe publications. The same sites that SS expeditions had investigated in the 1930s became focal points for post-war mystery writers. The same interpretive approaches that had once supported racial hierarchies now provided frameworks for speculation about ancient advanced civilizations and extraterrestrial influences on human development. This created a parallel intellectual universe where alternative theories about human history could flourish without the constraints of conventional peer review or empirical verification. Readers who found mainstream historical accounts disappointingly mundane could discover exciting alternatives that promised hidden knowledge and revolutionary insights about humanity's true potential. The entertainment industry proved even more receptive to these recycled mystical themes. Hollywood discovered that adventure stories featuring archaeological expeditions and supernatural artifacts could be easily separated from their Nazi origins while retaining all their psychological appeal. The same plot structures that had once served propaganda purposes now generated box office revenues and built loyal fan bases. Adventure films routinely featured elements that had been directly inspired by actual Nazi expeditions and research projects. Treasure hunting adventures, lost civilization discoveries, and ancient artifact recoveries all drew heavily on mystical narratives that had originally been developed to support racial theories and justify territorial conquest. This cultural appropriation created a peculiar situation where ideas that had once served the most evil regime in human history became sources of innocent entertainment for millions of people who had no awareness of their dark origins. The psychological mechanisms that had made Nazi mysticism appealing during the 1930s now served to sell movie tickets and build television ratings in countries that had fought against fascism. The internet age accelerated these trends exponentially, creating new platforms for sharing mystical content and building communities around alternative historical theories. Online forums allowed enthusiasts to collaborate on research projects and reinforce each other's convictions without interference from skeptical authorities or institutional gatekeepers. Video sharing websites enabled anyone with basic editing skills to create professional-looking documentaries that could reach global audiences instantly. The same production techniques that had once required expensive studio equipment were now available to individuals working from their homes, democratizing the creation and distribution of alternative historical content. Social media algorithms amplified these effects by showing users content similar to what they had previously engaged with, creating echo chambers where mystical theories could flourish without exposure to contradictory evidence. Someone who watched a video about mysterious archaeological discoveries might soon find their feed filled with increasingly exotic theories about ancient civilizations and suppressed historical truths. This digital ecosystem proved particularly effective at recruiting individuals who felt alienated from mainstream institutions and attracted to alternative explanations for complex phenomena. The promise of special knowledge accessible only to those willing to question official narratives provided psychological benefits that conventional education couldn't match. The recruitment process often followed patterns that bore striking resemblances to techniques perfected by Nazi mystical practitioners. Initial exposure would come through apparently harmless content about historical mysteries. Gradual escalation would introduce more exotic theories and conspiracy-minded interpretations. Eventually, some individuals would encounter explicitly ideological content that used mystical themes to promote political agendas. Contemporary movements have learned to exploit these pathways with sophisticated understanding of how mystical thinking can serve as a gateway to more dangerous beliefs. Ancient civilization theories might evolve into speculation about hidden elites controlling human development. Archaeological mysteries might become evidence for conspiracies suppressing important truths about racial hierarchies and genetic potential. The transformation isn't automatic, but the psychological mechanisms remain remarkably consistent across different historical contexts. The same human needs for meaning, belonging, and special knowledge that made Nazi occultism appealing continue to create vulnerabilities that extremist movements can exploit today. Educational systems have struggled to respond effectively to this flood of mystical content, masquerading as legitimate scholarship. Teachers find themselves fielding questions from students who have encountered alternative theories through popular media and want to know why their textbooks don't discuss ancient astronauts or lost Atlantean technologies. The challenge isn't simply correcting misinformation, but addressing the underlying psychological appeal of mystical explanations for historical mysteries. Students who have been exposed to alternative theories often find conventional historical accounts boring compared to exciting narratives about ancient advanced civilizations and supernatural interventions. Some educators have attempted to incorporate critical analysis of alternative theories into their curricula, hoping to teach students how to evaluate extraordinary claims. However, this approach often proves counterproductive by giving mystical theories additional credibility through academic attention, even when that attention is explicitly critical. The persistence of Nazi occult influences in contemporary culture reveals something profound about how extremist ideologies can outlive the political movements that created them. Ideas that seem obviously false or morally repugnant in their original context can survive and spread when separated from their political origins and presented as entertainment or scholarly speculation. This cultural continuity means that psychological techniques developed to promote Nazi mysticism continue to influence how millions of people understand the relationship between ancient history and modern identity. The specific political content may have been removed, but the underlying assumptions about hidden knowledge, secret elites, and suppressed truths remain remarkably intact. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity or entertainment preferences. When people learn to distrust mainstream institutions and seek alternative sources of authority, they become vulnerable to manipulation by movements that understand how to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities for political purposes. The Nazi experiment with occult politics ultimately failed catastrophically, destroying the very people it claimed to serve while causing immeasurable suffering for innocent victims. But the psychological techniques that made this experiment possible didn't disappear with Germany's military defeat. They remain part of human nature, waiting for new movements that understand how to harness our deepest desires for meaning and transcendence in service of their own destructive purposes. Understanding these historical patterns becomes crucial for recognizing how mystical themes continue to influence contemporary culture and politics in ways that extend far beyond obvious extremist organizations. The legacy of Nazi occultism persists not through direct ideological transmission, but through the preservation and adaptation of psychological techniques that proved effective at attracting intelligent individuals to irrational beliefs. The challenge for our generation involves developing approaches to mystery and speculation that honor genuine human curiosity while maintaining healthy skepticism about extraordinary claims. This requires cultural literacy about how mystical thinking functions and why it can be both inspiring and dangerous, depending on the contexts in which it operates. The artifacts may rest quietly in their display cases. The expeditions may be documented only in fading photographs, and the ceremonies may exist only in historical accounts. But the psychological forces that once drew respectable scholars into elaborate mystical delusions remain as powerful as ever, continuing to shape how we understand our past and imagine our future in ways we're only beginning to recognize. As we close this exploration of one of history's strangest chapters, perhaps the most important lesson is recognizing that the boundary between rational and mystical thinking is more fragile than we might prefer to believe. The same intellectual curiosity that drives genuine scientific discovery can, under the right circumstances, be channeled toward beliefs and practices that serve purposes their adherents never intended to support. The story of Nazi occultism serves as both historical documentation and contemporary warning, reminding us that human desires for transcendence and special knowledge, while natural and often beneficial, can become dangerous when exploited by movements that promise supernatural solutions to earthly problems while demanding absolute loyalty to charismatic leaders and exclusive belief systems. In our own age of information, abundance, and institutional skepticism, these lessons become more relevant than ever. The specific symbols may change, the particular theories may evolve, but the underlying psychological vulnerabilities remain constant, requiring vigilance and wisdom to prevent their exploitation by those who would use our highest aspirations to serve their lowest purposes. The chambers of Wewelsburg may be empty now, the expeditions to distant lands may be over, and the mystical artifacts may rest silently in storage rooms. But the deeper questions raised by this strange historical episode continue to resonate, challenging us to find ways of engaging with life's mysteries that honor both our need for meaning and our responsibility to truth, both our individual search for transcendence and our collective commitment to human dignity and compassion. The truth about Nazi occultism, as we've discovered together, isn't found in Hollywood adventures or conspiracy theories, but in something far more unsettling: the very human capacity to transform our deepest yearnings for meaning into instruments of power and control. What began as genuine spiritual curiosity in post-war Germany evolved into a systematic exploitation of mystical thinking that would outlast the regime itself by decades. From Himmler's candlelit ceremonies in Wewelsburg Castle to those desperate final days in Hitler's bunker, We've seen how the Third Reich's leaders gradually replaced rational decision-making with supernatural speculation. The expeditions to Tibet, the obsession with ancient artifacts, the astrological consultations that influenced military strategy, all of these weren't mere eccentricities, but symptoms of a deeper psychological vulnerability that continues to shape our world today. Perhaps most remarkably, the mystical ideas that once served the Nazi regime didn't simply vanish in 1945. Instead, they transformed and adapted, finding new audiences through entertainment, education, and digital media. The same theories about lost civilizations and ancient mysteries that once justified genocide now fill our bookshops and television screens, divorced from their toxic origins, but retaining their psychological appeal. This isn't just a historical curiosity, but a contemporary warning. The human needs that made Nazi mysticism so compelling, our desire for special knowledge, for hidden truths, for cosmic significance, these remain as powerful today as they were in the 1930s Germany. In our age of information abundance and institutional skepticism, understanding how rational individuals can gradually embrace irrational beliefs becomes more crucial than ever. The real mystery isn't whether ancient artifacts possess supernatural powers or whether lost civilizations once ruled the earth. The real mystery is why intelligent, educated people continue to find these ideas so compelling, and how movements throughout history have learned to weaponize our highest spiritual aspirations for their own destructive purposes. That's a mystery worth solving, because the answer might just help us recognize when our own search for meaning is being quietly redirected down paths we never intended to follow.